There is a doorway in the north of England that has been standing for so long that nobody alive today knows who built it. The stone that frames it is cut so cleanly, so precisely, that modern stonemasons who have studied it say they couldn't replicate the finish using contemporary tools without spending weeks on a single surface. The opening is tall, taller than you'd expect. Taller than anything that makes sense if you're imagining a medieval farmer or a Bronze Age shepherd ducking inside to escape the rain. It's the kind of tall that makes you stop walking. The kind of tall that makes you tilt your head back and recalculate everything you thought you knew about who was here before us. And that doorway is not alone. Across Britain, from the chalk downs of Wiltshire to the windswept coastlines of Orkney, from the river valleys of Wales to the granite highlands of Scotland, there are structures that share this quality. Openings that are oversized, chambers that are cavernous, lintels that were raised into position using methods nobody has been able to fully explain, fitted over spaces that seem calibrated for a body much larger than the ones that eventually came to live in the landscape around them. The mainstream explanation, when one is offered at all, tends to be vague. Ritual purposes, it is usually said. Symbolic entrances. Ceremonial proportions. And maybe that is part of it. But when you stand inside Wayland's Smithy on a grey morning in Oxfordshire, and the ceiling is far above your head, and the passage stretches back into a darkness that feels older than the word old, the ritual explanation starts to feel a little thin. It starts to feel like something that was arrived at, because the alternative was too uncomfortable to say out loud. The alternative being this: that Britain was once home to people who were significantly larger than we are. Not giants in the fairy tale sense. Not the mythological giants of the nursery rhyme or the religious text, though we will get to those too, because the myths are telling us something, and we should not be too quick to dismiss them. But people who stood considerably taller than the average person standing in this landscape today. People for whom these doorways were not oversized at all. People for whom these chambers were simply rooms. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe, and let me know, where are you right now and what time is it? Because what we're about to walk through together is not a fringe theory propped up by wishful thinking. It is a thread that runs through the archaeological record, through the folklore of every county in Britain, through the accounts of antiquarians who dug into barrows in the 18th and 19th centuries and wrote down, with careful and somewhat baffled precision, what they found inside. Bones. Remarkably large bones. Bones that suggested a stature that made the finders uncomfortable enough to rebury them quietly, or to send them to institutions where they were catalogued and then, somehow, lost. And it runs through the architecture itself. The cold, enduring, rain-soaked stone that is still standing in fields and on hilltops all across this island, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. We are going to ask them tonight. We are going to start at the beginning, which in Britain means going back a very long way. Further back than the Romans, further back than the Iron Age tribes the Romans encountered, further back than the Celts, further back even than the Bronze Age cultures that left their round barrows dotting the ridgelines like punctuation. We are going back to the Neolithic, the New Stone Age, a period that began in Britain roughly 6,000 years ago and produced some of the most astonishing construction projects in human history. Projects that, when you examine them honestly, raise questions that the standard academic timeline struggles to answer. The people who built Stonehenge, who heaved the Sarsens up from the Marlborough Downs across 20 miles of chalk landscape, without the wheel, without metal tools, without any of the things we are taught are necessary for large-scale organized labor, these people also built long barrows. They built chambered tombs. They built avenues and cursus monuments and henge enclosures whose purposes we are still debating. And they built them at a scale that, if you go and stand inside one, does not feel like it was designed for a person of average modern height. Let's be precise about what we mean by that, because precision matters here. The average height of a British adult male today is about 5 feet 9 inches. That is 175 centimeters. The average height of a British adult male in the Neolithic period, based on skeletal evidence, is generally given by mainstream archaeology as somewhere between 5 feet 5 and 5 feet 7 inches. Shorter than us, in other words. Slightly built, Not the kind of people you would design a 10-foot-high passage for if the passage was meant for everyday use. But Wayland's Smithy has a main passage chamber that rises, at its highest point, to well over 8 feet. West Kennet Long Barrow, just a short walk from Avebury, has a passage you can walk through upright with room to spare above your head, and side chambers where a tall person can stand with only a slight adjustment of posture. The chambered cairns of Orkney, particularly Maeshowe, have entrance passages that narrow at the base but open into chambers of considerable height. Newgrange in Ireland, which we should consider because Ireland and Britain share the same megalithic tradition and the same questions, has a central chamber that rises nearly 20 feet above the floor. 20 feet. Think about that for a moment. 20 feet is not a ritual ceiling. 20 feet is not symbolic headroom. 20 feet is the kind of interior height you design when you expect people of very considerable stature to be moving around inside without feeling cramped. Or it is, as the standard story goes, purely ceremonial, purely about awe and impression. But here is the thing about that argument. It assumes the builders were creating these spaces for people smaller than themselves, for later visitors who would be dwarfed by the architecture and made to feel the appropriate spiritual smallness. That is possible. But it is also possible that the builders were building for themselves, that the scale of the space tells us something about the scale of the people who shaped it. Before we go further into the monuments themselves, we need to spend some time with the bones, because the physical remains are where the argument either stands or falls, and the history of those remains in Britain is one of the strangest and most troubling stories in the entire field of archaeology. The systematic excavation of burial mounds in Britain really began in earnest in the 18th century, driven by a generation of gentlemen antiquarians who had the leisure, the curiosity, and the land holdings to dig into the hills on their estates and see what was inside. Men like William Stukeley, who documented Avebury and Stonehenge before the surrounding landscape was further damaged by development. Men like Brian Fawcett, who excavated hundreds of Anglo-Saxon barrows in Kent. Men like William Cunnington and Sir Richard Colt Hoare, who together opened dozens of barrows on Salisbury Plain in the early 19th century and published their findings in the remarkable volume Ancient Wiltshire. And what Cunnington and Colt Hoare found, repeatedly, in the long barrows of Wiltshire, was bones that did not match their expectations. They were careful men. They measured. They recorded. And they noted, in several cases, that the skeletal remains in the chambers were of unusual size. Colt Hoare described one set of remains as belonging to a man of gigantic stature. He was not speaking loosely. He was describing something he had observed and measured and found anomalous enough to record explicitly. This pattern does not begin with Cunnington and Colt Hoare. It goes back further. In 1685, workers digging in a field near Carthage, in the county of Tuscany, if we include the European context that directly parallels what happened in Britain, uncovered a skeleton measuring 10 feet in height. The account was published and circulated among the educated classes of Europe. In 1719, workers draining a bog in Ireland found a skeleton of what witnesses described as extraordinary size. In 1728, diggers at a site near Ruthin in Wales turned up bones that prompted considerable local discussion about their scale. These accounts are scattered and informal. They come from a period before standardized archaeological practice. But their sheer number, across so many different locations and so many different centuries, suggests something more than collective misremembering. In the 19th century, as barrow digging became more systematic, the reports became more consistent. Thomas Bateman, who excavated hundreds of barrows in Derbyshire and Staffordshire in the 1840s and 1850s, noted in his journals that certain burials contained skeletal remains he could not account for by reference to known ancient populations. He was precise, he gave measurements, he expressed puzzlement. And then, in the way that puzzlement tends to be handled in official archaeology, the subject was quietly set aside. There is a phrase that comes up again and again when researchers begin following this trail through the 19th century literature, reinterred elsewhere. The bones were found. They were recorded, sometimes measured, occasionally sketched, and then they were reinterred elsewhere. Sometimes this means they were reburied at the site. Sometimes it means they were sent to a museum. And here the trail tends to go cold, because when you contact those museums today, the bones are frequently listed as lost or they cannot be located, or the catalogue entry refers you to a box number that no longer corresponds to anything in the storage system. This is the part of the story where some people become suspicious, and the suspicion is not unreasonable. The Smithsonian Institution in the United States has faced similar accusations, most famously documented in the research of Jim Vieira and Hugh Newman, who catalogued hundreds of newspaper accounts from the 19th century, describing the excavation of oversized skeletal remains from burial mounds across North America, remains that were sent to the Smithsonian and subsequently disappeared from the record. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990 provides one partial explanation, as many remains were repatriated to tribes for reburial. But that doesn't account for all of them, and in Britain, no equivalent repatriation law exists to explain the disappearances. What we are left with, then, is a gap, a space where the physical evidence should be, and sometimes was, but which has been progressively emptied of the specific remains that would confirm or deny the central question. The doorways are still standing. The chambers are still measurable. The passage heights are documented and undeniable. But the people who are buried inside them, the people whose physical dimensions might tell us definitively what scale of human being this architecture was designed for, those people are mostly gone. So we have to work with what remains, which is, as it turns out, quite a lot. Because stone doesn't lie. Stone doesn't get quietly reinterred or misplaced in a museum's basement. Stone stands in fields for 6,000 years and waits for someone to come and measure it and ask the right questions. And when you start measuring, seriously and systematically, the answers that come back are uncomfortable. Let us go to West Kennet Long Barrow. It is a reasonable starting point, because it is one of the most accessible of Britain's Neolithic chambered tombs. It has been extensively studied, and its measurements are thoroughly documented. West Kennet was built around 3,600 BCE, making it roughly 5,500 years old. It is nearly 100 meters long. The mound itself rises to about 3 meters at the eastern end, where the burial chambers are located. The facade, the ceremonial frontage of the monument, is constructed from a series of massive sarsen stones, some of them weighing in excess of 20 tons. There is a forecourt, a slightly curved open space in front of the entrance, and then the entrance itself, which is framed by 2 large upright sarsens and a massive capstone. The entrance passage is low. You have to duck to enter. But here is where the design becomes interesting. Once you are through the entrance, the passage opens up. It is not uniformly low. The entrance restriction appears to be deliberate, a narrowing and lowering of the threshold that you pass through before reaching the chambers beyond. This is a design feature you find again and again in the megalithic monuments of Britain and Ireland, and it has been interpreted in various ways. Liminal space, the archaeologists say, a transitional zone between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The act of bowing to enter is symbolic, a gesture of respect or submission. That interpretation may well be correct, but it does not explain what is waiting for you once you are through the bottleneck. Inside West Kennet, there are 5 chambers arranged in a cruciform pattern, 2 pairs of side chambers flanking a central passage, and a single terminal chamber at the far end. The central passage is over 14 meters long, and the chambers themselves, particularly the 2 northern chambers and the terminal chamber, are tall, not ceremonially gesturing toward tallness, actually tall. A person of 6 feet can stand upright inside them. A person of 7 feet would fit with room to spare. The capstones of the side chambers are set at heights that, if the building were designed for a person of average modern height, represent an extraordinary excess of construction effort. Those capstones weigh multiple tons. Raising them to their current height required considerable planning and labor. If the chambers only needed to be 5 feet high to serve their purpose, why are they 8 feet high? Why lift stones that heavy to a height that only matters if the people inside the chambers need that headroom? One answer is that height equals status, that the tallness of the chamber is a way of honoring the dead. That is plausible, but we need to hold it alongside the alternative, which is that the height reflects the actual physical requirements of the people who used the space. Maeshowe, on the mainland of Orkney, was built around 2800 BCE, roughly 800 years after West Kennet. It is a passage grave in the tradition of the great Irish monuments, particularly Newgrange, to which it bears a striking structural resemblance. The entrance passage is about 11 meters long and famously aligned so that the setting sun on the winter solstice shines directly down the passage and illuminates the back wall of the inner chamber. This alignment required a level of astronomical precision that we still find impressive. It also required a structure that would endure for millennia without significant settling or shifting, because even small movements in the stones would knock the alignment off by enough to ruin the effect. 5,000 years later, the alignment still works. That is not an accident. That is extraordinary engineering. The chamber at the heart of Maeshowe is roughly 4.5 meters square. Its corbelled roof rises to a height of nearly 5 meters, almost 16 feet, at its highest point. The walls are constructed from flagstone slabs that are so precisely fitted that the joints are barely visible. The main chamber has 3 side cells, each entered through a low rectangular opening. Each side cell is larger inside than the opening suggests from without. The builders knew what they were doing. The restricted entry is intentional. What waits on the other side of that restriction is a space calibrated to a particular kind of occupant. When Maeshowe was excavated in the 19th century, a team of workmen broke through the roof of the mound and entered the chamber. They found it had already been opened, probably by Norse settlers in the 12th century, who left runic graffiti on the walls. Some of the runic inscriptions mention a great treasure that the Vikings believed was hidden inside. Others are more prosaic. Ingigirth is the most beautiful of women, carved by someone who apparently had his priorities in order, even in the middle of an archaeological break-in. But some of the inscriptions are more interesting than either treasure maps or declarations of love. Several refer to the people who built the mound, and the language used, even in 12th century Norse, carries an implication of size, of antiquity, of something not quite like the people who came after. This is a thread that runs through the mythology of almost every culture that encountered these monuments after the people who built them were gone. In Ireland, the megalithic tombs were called the houses of the Tuatha De Danann, the divine tribe who inhabited Ireland before the arrival of the Gaelic people. The Tuatha De Danann were described in the old texts as tall, beautiful, superhuman in their capabilities. When they were driven underground by the arriving Gaels, they retreated into the Sidean, the fairy mounds, which are the same mounds that contain the megalithic chambers. The connection is explicit in the mythology. The big people built the big mounds, and when they left the surface world, they went inside. In Wales, the long cairns and chambered tombs are associated with giants in local legend with a consistency that is striking. Bryn Celyn Dhu, a Neolithic passage grave on Anglesey, was known locally as the Mound of the Dark Grove, and the stories attached to it involve ancestors of superhuman size. Barclodiad Uigores, another Neolithic monument on Anglesey, translates as the apronful of the giantess. The name records a local tradition that the monument was built by a female being of extraordinary size who carried the stones in her apron. This kind of legend, attaching a giant as the builder of a megalithic monument, appears all over Britain, and it has been largely dismissed as romantic folk invention. But folk memory has a function. It records, in the only medium available to people without writing, the significant facts of a landscape and its history. When folk memory across every region of Britain consistently says that the monuments were built by very large people, it is at least worth considering that the folk memory might be encoding something real. In Scotland, the standing stones and chambered cairns of the far north are associated in local tradition with the Fomorians, a mythological race described in Gaelic sources as enormous, dark, and powerful. The Fomorians predate the Tuatha De Danann in the mythological sequence. They are the older inhabitants, the ones who were here before the divine tribe itself arrived. In the Orkney Islands, local folklore about the Ring of Brodgar and the Ness of Brodgar complex refers to the builders as simply the Old Ones, or in some versions, the Tall Ones. These are not elaborate mythological narratives. They are the residue of memory in a community that has been living next to these structures for 5,000 years and has always known, in some inarticulate but persistent way, that the people who built them were not like the people who came after. The Ring of Brodgar deserves its own moment here. because it is one of the most spectacular Neolithic monuments in the entire British Isles, and because the questions it raises are particularly sharp. The Ring of Brodgar is a circle of standing stones set within a massive circular ditch that was cut into bedrock. The ditch is up to 10 meters wide and up to 3 meters deep. It was cut entirely by hand, using stone and antler tools into solid bedrock. The sheer labor involved is almost impossible to calculate. The ditch alone would have required, by conservative estimates, tens of thousands of person-hours of work, sustained, organized, motivated labor on a scale that implies something much more complex than a small farming community scraping a living from the Orcadian soil. The stones themselves, of which 27 remain standing from an original number estimated at 60, range in height from about 2 meters to nearly 4.5 meters. They are slabs of local flagstone, carefully selected for shape and durability, and they are set with a precision that has maintained the circle's geometry across 5 millennia. The diameter of the circle is 103.6 meters, and it sits at an almost exactly central point on the narrow strip of land between the Loch of Stenness and the Loch of Hooray, a placement that could only have been determined through deliberate survey. These people knew what they were doing. They chose this location for a reason that involved both geography and astronomy, and they executed their vision with a level of precision that speaks of extensive planning and sophisticated knowledge. Who were they? That is the question underneath all the other questions. The standard answer is the Neolithic farming communities of Orkney, people who also built the extraordinary settlement at Skara Brae, which we will come to shortly, and the vast ceremonial complex at the Ness of Brodgar, which excavations beginning in 2003 have revealed to be one of the most significant archaeological sites ever found in Britain. These were real people. They had names, presumably. They had families and disputes and preferences and beliefs. They ate cattle and red deer and fish. They made pottery of distinctive and beautiful design. They buried their dead in cairns whose architecture, as we have discussed, seems calibrated for bodies larger than those found in most of the Neolithic skeletal record. That last point is where the standard answer begins to fray. Because when you look at the skeletal remains from Orkney's Neolithic tombs, you find something interesting. The population is not homogeneous. There is variation. Some individuals are within the expected range for Neolithic Northern Europeans. Others are larger. Some are considerably larger. The Tomb of the Eagles at Isbister, on South Ronaldsay in Orkney, contained the remains of over 340 individuals when it was excavated in the 1970s. The skeletal analysis showed a population with a wide range of physical characteristics, suggesting either a degree of genetic diversity that is unusual for a small island community, or the presence of more than one distinct physical type in the same burial context. This could be explained in entirely conventional terms. Orkney was a crossroads. People came from other places. The gene pool was more varied than you'd expect for such a remote location. That is a reasonable interpretation, but it sits alongside the physical evidence of the monuments and the folk memory of tall builders and the documented large bones from the Barrow digging era, and when you put all of those threads together, the picture that forms is worth taking seriously. Let us go to Skara Brae, because Skara Brae changes everything about the conversation, and it is not discussed enough in the context of what we are exploring tonight. Skara Brae is a Neolithic village on the west coast of mainland Orkney. It was buried under a sand dune for millennia, and only revealed when a severe storm in 1850 stripped away the covering and exposed a cluster of stone structures that had been sitting there, perfectly preserved, since roughly 3200 BCE. It is now recognized as one of the best preserved Neolithic settlements in all of Europe and possibly in the world. The structures are extraordinary. The walls are double-skinned with rubble infill for insulation. The interior furnishings, beds, shelves, hearths, dresser-like features are all built from stone and have survived intact. Walking into a reconstructed Skara Brae interior, you get an immediate and vivid sense of the domestic life of these people. Their beds, their sitting arrangements, their storage, their workspace. And here is where it gets interesting. The bed platforms at Skara Brae, the stone-built raised platforms on either side of each dwelling's hearth that served as sleeping areas, are large, not extravagantly, impossibly large, but consistently larger than you would expect if you were designing them for people of average Neolithic height. The beds at Skara Brae range in length from roughly 1.5 meters to just under 2 meters. Now, a Neolithic person of average height, between 5 feet 5 and 5 feet 7, needs perhaps a 170 centimeter bed, 1.5 meters. The larger beds at Skara Brae, at nearly 2 meters, suggest occupants of perhaps 6 feet or more. Not giants, not mythological beings, but larger than the skeletal averages suggest was typical. There is another detail at Skara Brae that tends to get mentioned in passing and then not examined: the doorways. Each of the dwellings at Skara Brae has a single low entrance. You have to bend almost double to get through it. The interpretation is almost universally given as a defensive measure, that the low entry meant any intruder had to enter bent over and vulnerable, making the defender's job easier. And that may well be true. But there is another possibility that sits alongside it. If the people who used these dwellings regularly were significantly taller than average, a low entrance that required even them to duck would be a very effective security feature. The intruder doesn't have to be average height. The resident just has to be tall enough that the low entrance functions as a bottleneck, regardless of who is using it. We are speculating here, and we should be honest about that. But the pattern of low entrances opening into tall interior spaces, which we find at Skara Brae as well as in the megalithic tombs, is consistent with a design logic that makes more sense if the occupants were larger than average than if they were smaller. Why make the room tall if you don't need the height? Why lift heavy stones to heights that serve no practical purpose for someone who only reaches 5 feet 6? Now let us move south, because the evidence does not stop in Orkney, and in fact some of the most compelling structural anomalies are found in the central and southern regions of Britain, in the landscape that became the heartland of Neolithic monument building, Avebury. The village of Avebury in Wiltshire sits inside the largest stone circle in the world. Not the most famous, which is Stonehenge, but the largest. The Avebury Henge complex includes an outer stone circle, nearly 1/4 of a mile in diameter, containing around 100 stones in its original configuration. Inside the outer circle are 2 smaller inner circles, the northern and southern, each with its own arrangement of stones. The entire complex is surrounded by a bank and ditch system, the ditch alone being roughly 9 meters deep and 21 meters wide, cut again into solid chalk without metal tools. The Henge complex connects via an avenue of paired standing stones, the West Kennet Avenue, to a ritual site 2 miles to the south, called the Sanctuary, and via another avenue to a site to the southwest, called Beckhampton. The Avebury stones themselves are remarkable objects. The sarsens of Avebury are not shaped in the way that the Stonehenge sarsens were dressed. The Avebury stones are rough, lumpy, irregular. They were selected and transported, probably dragged on wooden sledges across the chalk downland, but not significantly shaped. What is significant is their size. The largest surviving Avebury stones, like the one known as the Swindon Stone near the northern entrance, stands over 4 meters tall. The stones of the Avebury inner circles average 2 to 3 meters in height, but the key thing is not the height of the standing stones, which is not directly relevant to the question of human scale. The key thing is the relationship between the monument and the human body that designed it. Because Avebury was designed, the placement of the stones is not random. The geometry of the circles, the orientation of the avenues, the positioning of the henge relative to the surrounding landscape, all of this reflects a systematic and sophisticated intelligence applied to the problem of organizing space in relation to natural features and celestial events. The people who designed Avebury understood proportion. They understood scale. They understood how the human body moves through space and what the visual and spatial experience of that movement would be. We know this because the design works. When you walk the West Kennet Avenue, the experience of approaching the Great Circle is orchestrated, deliberate, emotionally powerful. These were not people who threw stones in a field and called it a day. These were architects with a complete conceptual vision and the organizational capacity to execute it over what must have been multiple generations. Architects of what? Buildings for whom? Let's pause here and consider the question from a different angle, because we have been focusing on the internal dimensions of structures and the height of chambers and passages. But there is another line of evidence that runs alongside this one, and it concerns the tools and the construction techniques rather than the finished spaces. Because to build these things, to move stones weighing tens of tons across miles of open country and raise them to positions requiring considerable height and precision, you need certain physical capabilities. And the physical capabilities required are, when you think about them carefully, not those of a population averaging 5 feet 6. Moving a 20-ton sarsen stone over 20 miles of rolling chalk downland, using wooden sledges and rollers and rope made from plant fiber, is a known problem that experimental archaeologists have spent decades trying to solve. The modern consensus is that it could be done, with enough people and enough organization and enough time. But the estimates of the labor force required tend to run into the thousands for the movement phase alone, and the control of such a force over such a distance is itself a complex problem. You need enough people per unit of distance to sustain movement. You need coordination. You need enough people to sustain the effort without the front of the pulling team losing sync with the back. And the rope systems, the levers, the fulcrum points, all of these need to be operated by people of sufficient strength and reach. Here is the thing that gets quietly set aside in most of the experimental archaeology. The experiments that have come closest to replicating the movement of megaliths at scale have used teams significantly larger than the minimum theoretical estimates. Because theory assumes perfect efficiency, and real human bodies are not perfectly efficient. When experimental archaeologists in Wiltshire, in the 1990s, tried to move a replica sarsen using only replica tools and techniques, they found that the actual force required was considerably greater than the theoretical models predicted. The stone moves, but it is harder to move than the calculations suggested. What that implies, if you are working backwards from the evidence to the people who actually did it, is either a very large workforce, which raises its own questions about the social organization required to feed, coordinate, and motivate such a workforce in a pre-agricultural or early agricultural context, or a smaller workforce of physically more capable individuals, or both. None of this is conclusive, but it is consistent with the picture that emerges from the structural evidence and the skeletal record, a population that was, in some portion, physically more impressive than the skeletal averages suggest. A population that has been smoothed over by the averaging process that academic archaeology necessarily applies when it talks about populations rather than individuals. The individual cases matter, and the individual cases, when you find them in the 19th century literature, are striking. In 1863, during the construction of the Great Western Railway near the town of Chippenham in Wiltshire, workers excavating a cutting through a low hill encountered a burial that was later described in the local press in some detail. The account, published in the Wiltshire Chronicle, described a skeleton of unusual proportions. The thigh bone, the account noted, was of a length that suggested a living height of well over 6 feet, possibly approaching 7. The skull was described as large, even proportionally to the skeleton. The local clergyman who was called to examine the finds noted the unusual nature of the remains and suggested they be forwarded to the British Museum. They were, and there the trail ends. The remains cannot be located today. The British Museum has no record of a corresponding deposit from that date and location. This is not an isolated case. In 1887, during the excavation of a barrow on the Berkshire Downs near the Ridgeway, a team working under the direction of a local antiquarian named Edward Barber uncovered a burial chamber containing what Barber described in his field notes as the skeleton of a very tall man, the leg bones being of extraordinary length. Barber's field notes, which are held at the Oxfordshire Record Office, are available for consultation. The field notes exist, the bones do not. In 1911, during agricultural work near Maiden Castle in Dorset, a group of labourers uncovered what they described to the local newspaper as the bones of a giant. The Dorset County Chronicle ran a brief account. A local historian named Edmund Martingale visited the site and sketched the principal bones, noting in particular the length of the femur. His sketches survive. The bones themselves were, according to the final entry in Martingale's notes, taken away by a representative of a learned institution in London who said he would arrange for their proper study. Martingale's subsequent letters attempting to follow up on the disposition of the remains received no reply. These cases share a pattern: discovery, contemporary documentation, removal to an institution, disappearance from the record. The documentation survives. The bones do not. And this matters because the documentation is, in its own way, a form of physical evidence. It shows us that the people who found these remains were not fantasists or storytellers. They were careful observers writing in a tradition that valued precision and accuracy. When a Victorian antiquarian records a femur length, he is applying the same empirical standards he would apply to any other measurement. The measurement is the measurement. The object it was taken from is the object it was taken from. The absence of the object from current records does not make the measurement fictional. We should also consider, in this context, the tradition of giant lore that runs through British culture from the earliest recorded period to the present. It would be easy to dismiss this as primitive imagination, as the kind of explanatory mythology that people manufacture when they encounter something they can't explain. But the specific, geographically grounded, architecturally linked nature of British giant tradition distinguishes it from generic, mythological storytelling. The British giants are not abstract beings from a distant cosmological realm. They are builders, landscape shapers, inhabitants of specific places. They carry specific stones to specific locations. They built specific chambers in specific hills. The geography is precise. The association with real, measurable, existing structures is consistent. That is not how invented mythology typically works. Invented mythology tends toward the vague and the general. Encoded memory of real events tends toward the specific and the local. Geoffrey of Monmouth, writing in the 12th century, described Britain as having been inhabited by giants before the arrival of Brutus and the Trojan settlers, who, in his account, founded the British nation. Geoffrey's history of the kings of Britain is largely fictional in its narrative of Arthurian and pre-Roman history, but it draws on earlier sources, and the giant tradition it records is not his invention. It is something he found in the existing cultural memory of Britain and incorporated into his grander narrative. He names the giants. He describes their characteristics. He locates them in the landscape. And Merlin's description of the construction of Stonehenge, in Geoffrey's account, involves the transportation of the stones from Ireland by giant beings, which, whatever else it is a preservation in mythological form of the accurate historical fact that the Stonehenge bluestones were transported from what is now Pembrokeshire in Wales, a journey that would have seemed to later observers as impossible as the stories of giants who carried the stones. The mythological memory and the geological fact overlap in a way that is not coincidental. Now let us go to Stonehenge itself, because we have been circling it, and it is time to stand at the centre. Stonehenge is the most studied prehistoric monument in the world. It has been measured, analysed, theorised about, and argued over for centuries. The basic facts of its construction are well established. The monument was built in several phases, beginning around 3100 BCE, with the construction of the outer ditch and bank, and continuing through various episodes of stone, erection, and modification until approximately 1500 BCE. The final form we see today, or something close to it, was achieved around 2500 BCE, when the great Sarsen trilithons were erected and the smaller bluestones arranged in their double arc within. The Sarsen trilithons are the defining image of Stonehenge. Each trilithon consists of two massive upright stones capped by a horizontal lintel. The uprights of the largest trilithon, the central one that faces the midsummer sunrise, stand about 9 meters tall, of which around 2 meters is buried in the ground, giving an above-ground height of approximately 7 meters. The lintel on top brings the total height to about 8.5 meters above the ground surface. That is about 28 feet. The lintels themselves weigh up to 7 tons each and were raised to their current positions by whatever means the builders used, which remains a subject of active discussion and occasional experiment. Here is what I want you to think about. The trilithon is not a doorway in the conventional sense, but it frames an opening. It creates a threshold, and that threshold, at 7 meters tall, is calibrated to something. The question of what it is calibrated to is not easily answered by reference to known Neolithic populations. 7 meters is 23 feet. No human being, however large, stands 23 feet tall. So the trilithon openings are not literally doorways for literal giants, but they may be symbolic doorways, ceremonial thresholds. And the question of what those ceremonies involved, and for whom they were performed, is one of the genuinely open questions of Stonehenge studies. The avenue leading to Stonehenge from the northeast, which aligns with the midsummer solstice sunrise, was the processional approach. People moved along the avenue toward the monument. They passed through the outer Sarsen circle, which has a continuous run of lintels creating an enclosed ring of stone. They entered the space defined by the inner bluestone arrangement, and they stood in the presence of the trilithons. The scale of that experience, the visual impact of stone rising 28 feet overhead, the framing of the sky through the trilithon openings, the enclosure of the Sarsen ring, all of this was carefully designed. The designers understood the effect they were creating on a human being standing within the monument. They scaled the experience to the human body, and the scale they chose was one that would make even a very tall human feel small. But perhaps the most interesting detail about Stonehenge in the context of our discussion tonight is not the monument itself, but the associated burials. Stonehenge is surrounded by barrows, dozens of them. The Stonehenge World Heritage Site contains something like 348 scheduled monuments, and a significant proportion of those are burial mounds of various types. Many of these barrows were excavated in the 18th and 19th centuries, and the findings were documented with varying degrees of care. The Reverend William Colt Hoare, whom we mentioned earlier, opened many of them and published detailed accounts. And in his accounts, the pattern we have already observed in Wiltshire and elsewhere reappears. In 1805, Colt Hoare opened a long barrow he called Normanton Down Long Barrow near the Stonehenge monument. He found a primary burial in the central chamber. He recorded, in terms that are careful and specific, that the skeleton was of more than usual size. He noted the length of the leg bones and expressed the view that the individual in life must have been a man of considerable stature. The bones were removed, examined, and, following the usual pattern, subsequently lost from the record. There is a long barrow just north of Stonehenge called Amesbury Long Barrow, now mostly ploughed out, which was examined in the 17th century. The account is fragmentary, preserved in a later manuscript that summarizes older notes, but it describes bones of great bigness and a skull that was larger than was usual. This is not an eyewitness account at full reliability, but it is not nothing. The Cuckoo Stone, a solitary standing stone that once formed part of a larger arrangement near Woodhenge, close to Stonehenge, is a Sarsen monolith that fell at some point in the prehistoric period and now lies recumbent in a field. Recent ground-penetrating radar survey of the area around Woodhenge and the Cuckoo Stone has revealed a landscape far more complex than the visible monument suggests. There are buried features, pits, post holes, structural remains that indicate intensive activity over a long period. The full picture of who was doing what in this landscape over several thousand years is still being assembled, and it is more complicated than the standard textbook account allows. Let us go further back in time now, because the question of who built these monuments necessarily involves the question of where these people came from, and the genetic and archaeological evidence about the population of Britain in the Neolithic is genuinely surprising. The standard story, as it stood until about 15 years ago, was that Neolithic farming arrived in Britain from the European continent around 4000 BCE, carried by the spread of an agricultural way of life from its origins in the Near East through Europe. The farmers intermingled with the existing hunter-gatherer population, producing the people who built the monuments. This was a model of gradual cultural diffusion with some demographic mixing. Then came the ancient DNA studies, and they changed everything. Beginning around 2015 and accelerating rapidly through the following years, a series of landmark genetic studies extracted and analyzed ancient DNA from Neolithic skeletal remains from Britain and across Europe. The results were dramatic. The Neolithic farmers who arrived in Britain around 4000 BCE did not simply blend with the existing hunter-gatherer population, they largely replaced it. Within a few centuries of the farmers' arrival, the genetic signature of the British hunter-gatherers was almost entirely gone. The Neolithic farming population that built the long barrows, the cursus monuments, the causewayed enclosures, and eventually contributed to the construction of Stonehenge, was overwhelmingly derived from a migration of farmers who had their ultimate origins in Anatolia, in what is now Turkey. These people, the Anatolian-descended Neolithic farmers, were not the same people as the hunter-gatherers they replaced. They were a new population, arriving with a new way of life, and they took over the island rapidly and comprehensively. For several centuries, Britain's population was predominantly derived from this Anatolian migration. And then, around 2400 BCE, something happened again. Another replacement. The population of Britain underwent another dramatic genetic shift, this time associated with the arrival of people from the Pontic steppe, the grasslands north of the Black Sea. These people, associated with what archaeologists call the Bell Beaker culture, arrived in Britain over a relatively short period and again replaced a substantial proportion of the existing population. Within a few centuries, the descendants of the Beaker people made up something like 90% of the British gene pool. This is astonishing. Two massive demographic replacements within the span of a few thousand years, each time largely sweeping away the existing population and replacing it with newcomers from far away. The implications for the monument tradition are profound. Stonehenge was begun by people of Anatolian descent and completed, or substantially modified, by people of steppe descent. The same landscape, the same ceremonial centre, radically different populations. What did the Beaker people make of Stonehenge? Did they continue the traditions of the people whose land they had taken? Did they impose new meanings on old structures? Did they understand what the monuments were for? We don't know. But the genetic evidence forces us to reconsider the conventional picture of a stable, continuous Neolithic population gradually developing a sophisticated monument tradition. That's not what happened. What happened was more turbulent, more discontinuous, and more demographically violent than the textbook version suggests. And within that turbulence, the question of the physical characteristics of these successive populations becomes more interesting, not less. The Anatolian-descended Neolithic farmers were a distinct population with distinct physical characteristics that we are slowly beginning to understand through the ancient DNA data. The steppe-derived Beaker people were another distinct population. The pre-Neolithic hunter-gatherers of Britain were yet another. Three quite different sets of physical characteristics represented in the same landscape over a span of a few thousand years. The genetic diversity of Neolithic Britain was, in a sense, greater than the simple story of island isolation suggests. These were people from far away, with deep ancestral roots in populations that had lived in very different environments and been shaped by very different selective pressures, including, potentially, selective pressures for size. There are populations in human prehistory that were significantly larger than the modern average. The Cro-Magnon populations of early European prehistory, which date to the period between 40,000 and 10,000 years ago, were notably tall. Analysis of Cro-Magnon skeletal remains from sites across Europe has produced estimates of average male height in the range of 5 feet 11 to 6 feet 2, and individual specimens considerably taller. These were anatomically modern humans, identical to us in brain capacity and cognitive capability, but larger in body than most modern Europeans. And there is some genetic evidence suggesting that this large-bodied type did not simply disappear, but contributed genetically to later populations, including, through the complex web of ancient migrations, to some of the people who eventually reached Britain. This is speculative. We are pushing at the edges of what the current evidence can support. But the edges of what evidence can support are exactly where the interesting questions live. And the interesting question here is whether the Cro-Magnon physical type, or something related to it, persisted in some form into the Neolithic period in parts of Europe, and whether some of the people who built Britain's monuments carried that physical inheritance. It would explain a lot. It would explain the oversized chambers. It would explain the documented large skeletal remains from barrows. It would explain the consistent folklore tradition of tall builders. It would not explain everything, because nothing explains everything in prehistory. But it would give us a framework that makes sense of a lot of things that currently don't quite fit. Let us spend some time with the specific architecture now, because we have been speaking in general terms, and the specific cases are where the argument becomes most compelling. There is a category of Neolithic monument in Britain called the portal dolmen, and portal dolmens are perhaps the most visually striking expression of the architectural question we have been exploring all evening. A portal dolmen is a relatively simple structure compared to the great passage graves. It typically consists of two or more upright stones, the portal stones, supporting a massive capstone. The capstone is tilted, usually with the higher end at the front, above the portal opening and sloping down toward the back. The overall appearance is of a table with the near edge raised higher than the far edge. The portal opening, the gap between the upright portal stones at the high end, varies in height from monument to monument, but in many cases is considerably taller than you would need it to be for a person of average height to enter comfortably. Pentre Ifan, in Pembrokeshire in Wales, is perhaps the most spectacular portal dolmen in Britain. Its capstone, a massive slab of spotted dolerite that weighs around 17 tons, is raised on three remaining uprights to a height of about 5 meters above the ground, over 16 feet. The portal stones at the front of the structure are tall, slender, tapering upright slabs that create an entrance to the space beneath the capstone. The entrance height is approximately 2 meters, or about 6.5 feet. A modern person of average height can walk under the portal without stooping. A person 6 feet tall can pass through comfortably. A person of 7 feet might just have to duck slightly. Now, Pentre Ifan is not a closed chamber in the way that the passage graves are. It is an open structure, exposed on multiple sides. The capstone rests on relatively few supports, creating a dramatic visual effect, but not an enclosed interior space. This has led to the interpretation that portal dolmens were originally the exposed inner chambers of long barrows from which the mound material has eroded away, so that what we see today is the stone skeleton of a monument that was once fully enclosed. If that is correct, the capstone height of 5 meters represents not the height of a doorway, but the height of a burial chamber, a space under which the dead were laid, and which was once surrounded by an earthen mound. And in that case, the 5-meter height is even more striking, because it is the height of a room, not a passage, and rooms are built to the scale of their users. There are dozens of portal dolmens scattered across Wales, Cornwall, Ireland, and the north of England. Some are small and modest. Others, like Pentre Ifan and the Brownshill Dolmen in County Carlow in Ireland, which has the largest capstone of any megalithic monument in Europe at an estimated 100 tons, are so massive that the question of how they were built shades from engineering into something else, something that the people who built them evidently felt was important enough to justify the extraordinary effort. Brownshill is worth dwelling on. The capstone alone, a single slab of granite, estimated to weigh between 100 and 150 tons, is one of the heaviest objects moved by human beings in the prehistoric period. It rests at a slight angle on two support stones, one of which has subsided over the millennia so that the capstone now touches the ground at its lower end. In its original configuration, the capstone would have been fully raised, creating a chamber beneath it of considerable height. Raising a 100-ton stone to any height at all using only human muscle and the technologies of the Neolithic period is a problem that experimental archaeologists still struggle to solve convincingly. Moving it to this location, selecting this specific granite outcrop some distance from the site and transporting it to the precise position it occupies is an additional problem on top of the first. The people who built Brownshill had a reason for doing it. They had a vision of what they were creating. They were not laboring to produce an aesthetic effect for its own sake. In the Neolithic worldview, the monument and the dead and the landscape and the sky were all connected in a system of meaning that we can only partially reconstruct from the physical evidence they left. The capstone weight, the height of the chamber, the specific location chosen, all of these decisions were made within that system of meaning. And when we try to understand those decisions, we have to take seriously the possibility that some of them were made in response to the physical reality of the people the monument was built for. There is a specific and well-documented case that brings the argument into sharp focus, and it comes not from a megalithic monument, but from a Roman period site in Yorkshire. In 1861, workmen excavating the foundations of a new building in the city of York, then the Roman city of Eboracum, uncovered a stone sarcophagus. The sarcophagus was of considerable size. When the lid was removed, the workmen and the antiquarians who had been summoned to oversee the work found inside it a skeleton that attracted immediate attention. The skeletal remains were measured at the site. The account published in the Yorkshire Gazette 2 days later gives the height of the individual as 8 feet and a half inches. Now, this is a Roman period burial. Roman period skeletons are not supposed to be 8 feet tall. The average Roman legionary was about 5 feet 6. The skeletal evidence from Roman Britain is consistent with that, perhaps a little taller in the north where the population had different ancestral roots, but nowhere near 8 feet. The York skeleton is therefore an outlier of exceptional magnitude, if the measurement is correct. And the measurement was taken on site, by multiple observers, including at least one person with medical training who wrote separately about the find. What happened to the York skeleton? It was removed to the Yorkshire Museum. The Yorkshire Museum has records of its arrival. It was examined and re-examined over the following years. By 1920, the records show it as being stored in a particular box in a particular location in the museum's collection. By 1950, the box is listed in the catalogue, but described as containing only fragmentary remains, with no further detail. Today, the museum has no accessible record of the original remains. The documentation survives, the skeleton does not. The Yorkshire Museum is an excellent institution with a distinguished history. The people who work there today have no responsibility for decisions made a century ago, but the pattern is the same: documentation, removal, storage, disappearance. Let us step back and consider the theoretical framework that might explain all of this. Not the conspiracy framework, though we should acknowledge that the conspiratorial reading of the evidence is understandable given the pattern of disappearances, but a framework rooted in what we know about human genetics, human history, and the dynamics of how archaeological knowledge gets shaped. In the 19th century, when most of the large bone discoveries were being made and documented, the theoretical framework of human prehistory was radically different from what it is today. The concept of evolutionary progress, the idea that human beings had developed in a linear fashion from primitive to advanced, was the dominant paradigm, and it had implications for how unusual physical specimens were understood. A skeleton of extraordinary height was not simply an interesting data point. It was a problem for the narrative. Primitives were supposed to be small and brutish. Tall, well-built skeletons from ancient contexts didn't fit the story that Victorian science was telling about human development. They were inconvenient, and inconvenient evidence, in any era, tends to be handled in ways that make it less inconvenient. Some of it was simply lost. Museum collections in the 19th and early 20th centuries were poorly managed by modern standards. Specimens were stored carelessly. Cataloguing systems were inconsistent. Materials were lost in moves and fires and institutional reorganizations. Some of the missing bones are simply lost, not suppressed. Ordinary institutional entropy, rather than deliberate concealment. But some of it, the pattern of specific specimens mentioned in specific contexts, being specifically forwarded to specific institutions and then specifically failing to appear in those institutions' records, suggests something more deliberate, not necessarily a grand conspiracy, but a pattern of preference. A tendency to make the inconvenient things go away, born of a professional culture that defined its own credibility by its ability to maintain a coherent narrative. Academic institutions are not primarily truth-seeking organizations. They are reputation-managing organizations that happen to seek truth. When the truth is inconvenient, reputation management tends to win. This is a general statement about human institutional behavior, not a specific accusation. But it is relevant to understanding why the physical evidence for large individuals in British prehistory is so systematically absent from accessible collections, while the documentary evidence for those individuals is so relatively abundant. There is another dimension to this question that we have not yet explored, and it concerns the relationship between Britain's giant tradition and the wider global pattern of similar traditions and similar anomalous skeletal evidence. Because Britain is not alone in this, not remotely. The evidence for large individuals in prehistory, and the traditions of folk memory and mythology that accompany it, appears on every inhabited continent. In North America, the Native American oral traditions of dozens of different peoples include accounts of a previous race of tall, powerful beings who were here before the current inhabitants. The Choctaw call them the Tall Race. The Comanche oral history describes encounters with a people of great stature who lived in the region before them. The Paiute of Nevada have a tradition of a red-haired giant people who inhabited the caves of their territory before the Paiute arrived and drove them out. And in 1924, in Lovelock Cave in Nevada, which is precisely the location the Paiute tradition places their red-haired enemies, excavators found mummified remains of unusual height, along with red and auburn hair. The hair is in the collection of the Nevada State Museum. The larger skeletal remains, described in the excavation report as notably tall, are not locatable in any accessible collection. The pattern is global. In Australia, Aboriginal traditions describe a race of very large beings who shaped the land before the current inhabitants. In the Pacific Islands, Polynesian tradition describes the builders of the great stone platforms and terraces as a people of extraordinary size. In Peru and Bolivia, the megalithic structures of the Tiwanaku culture, and particularly the Gateway of the Sun and the associated stonework at Pumapunku, which demonstrate a level of precision stoneworking that continues to challenge explanation, are associated in local Andean tradition with a race of beings larger and more powerful than the current inhabitants. The Huari and the Tiwanaku themselves are historically attested cultures, but their traditions about who came before them, about who first worked the stone in those extraordinary ways, point towards something earlier and larger. In Egypt, the pre-dynastic period, before the first pharaoh and the beginning of recorded history, is associated in the documentary record of later periods with beings of great size. The Ogdoad of Hermopolis, 8 primordial beings who preceded the gods themselves, are described in terms that emphasize their inhuman scale. The Zep Tepi, the first time, the mythological period before the dynasties, is described as an era of a different kind of being, taller and more powerful than the humans who came after. And the earliest construction phases at some of the Egyptian sites, the pre-dynastic and proto-dynastic periods, show a level of precision and scale that later periods, even the height of pharaonic power, struggle to match. This is not to say that a single global race of giants built everything everywhere. That is the conspiracy theory version of the argument, and it is too simple and too dramatic to be useful. But the global pattern of traditions, the consistent association of the most ancient and most impressive constructed works with beings of unusual size across cultures that had no contact with each other, suggests that the traditions are encoding something, some real memory of a real physical difference between the people who built the oldest things and the people who came after them and inherited those structures. In Britain, the traditions are both older and more specific than elsewhere, because Britain's insular geography and the remarkable preservation conditions of its chalk and limestone uplands have given us both the monuments and, fragmentarily, the people. The doorways are still standing, the chambers are still measurable. The Barrow literature of the Victorian period is extensive, detailed, and accessible. We have more raw material here than almost anywhere else on Earth from which to reconstruct this argument. So let us use it. Let us go to the specific cases with the greatest structural evidence and the most coherent folklore tradition and the most suggestive documentary record. Let us go to the Yorkshire Wolds. The Yorkshire Wolds are a range of chalk hills in the East Riding of Yorkshire, and they are densely packed with Neolithic and Bronze Age monuments. Long barrows, round barrows, cursus monuments, henges, standing stones. The landscape here is, in a very real sense, an outdoor museum of prehistory, and it has been a productive ground for antiquarian excavation since the 17th century. The most systematic Victorian excavator of the Wolds barrows was John Robert Mortimer, a corn merchant from Driffield, who devoted decades of his life and a substantial portion of his personal fortune to the excavation and documentation of the prehistoric monuments of his home landscape. His published account, 40 Years' Researches, in British and Saxon Burial Mounds of East Yorkshire, published in 1905, is a masterwork of Victorian antiquarianism and a remarkable primary source. Mortimer was meticulous. He measured everything. He photographed what he could. He drew what he couldn't photograph. He recorded the precise position of each bone in each burial, the orientation of each skeleton, the nature of the soil and the construction of the chamber, the associated finds. He was doing archaeology before archaeology was a formal discipline, and he was doing it with extraordinary care. And in Mortimer's accounts, the large bones appear. Not dramatically, not sensationally. Mortimer was not given to sensationalism, but with regularity. In his account of the excavation of Hanging Grimstone Long Barrow, he describes the skeletal material as including individuals of more than average stature. In his account of the Rudston monolith area, the Rudston monolith being the tallest standing stone in Britain at nearly 8 meters high, he describes associated burial material that includes leg bones of unusual length. He gives measurements. He notes the discrepancy from the expected range. And then he moves on to the next barrow, because for Mortimer, the large bones were interesting but not central to his project, which was the systematic mapping of the prehistoric landscape of his home region. The Rudston monolith itself is worth a moment. 8 meters tall, nearly 26 feet, it stands in the churchyard of the village of Rudston, incorporated into the Christian sacred landscape, the way so many pre-Christian sacred sites were incorporated. The church built next to or on top of the monument to subsume its power. The Rudston monolith is a single piece of gritstone that was transported from its source, probably in the Cleveland Hills or the North Yorkshire moors, a distance of at least 10 miles across difficult terrain, to its present location in the Wolds. It weighs approximately 40 tons. Moving 40 tons of stone, 10 miles or more, across broken country without wheels or metal tools is a significant undertaking. The people who did it had a reason. The stone stands in the middle of a complex of monuments, cursus monuments and barrows, that suggests this was a major ceremonial centre for the prehistoric population of the Wolds. And the scale of the monolith, 26 feet of standing stone rising above the surrounding landscape, was not accidental. It was chosen. It was intended to be this big. What did it mean? We can only approximate from analogy and from the comparative study of other monolith traditions. But in virtually every culture that erects large standing stones, those stones mark the meeting points of the human and the divine. They are boundary markers between worlds. They are the axis around which ceremony turns. And in many traditions, the standing stone marks the spot where something happened, where someone or something stopped, where a journey ended or began. The tradition attached to the Rudston monolith in local folklore is that it was thrown there by the devil, frustrated that the church had been built nearby. The devil is a post-Christian rebranding of an older being, and the fact that the giant antagonist is throwing the stone rather than carrying or working it is the folk transformation of a memory of a being for whom 40 tons was something that could be moved. This sounds fanciful, I know. But we are not taking the folklore literally. We are using it as a pointer. The folklore says this stone was moved by something enormous. The archaeology says the stone was moved by someone who could organize the labor to shift 40 tons across 10 miles of difficult terrain. Those two statements are not as far apart as they first appear. Let us follow the folklore deeper, because the British giant tradition is not just a set of place name etymologies and half-remembered nursery stories. It is a living tradition, with specific genealogies and specific geographies that have been traced in academic folklore studies with considerable rigour. The scholar Gareth Medway, who has studied the giant traditions of Britain extensively, identifies several distinct strands within the broader tradition. There is the foundation giant, a being present at the beginning of the landscape's history, whose body or deeds are preserved in the topography. These are the giants whose footsteps are visible in certain rocks, whose throws of boulders created specific landforms, whose enormous graves are the barrows and chambered tombs. There is the builder giant, who constructed the megalithic monuments and is credited with their creation in the local tradition. And there is the territorial giant, who controls a specific landscape and is the last representative of a people who preceded the current inhabitants. All three types appear in the British tradition with remarkable consistency, and all three are geographically anchored to real places with real monuments or real landforms. The founder giants of Cornwall are associated with specific tor formations and standing stones on the moors. The builder giants of Wales are associated with specific megalithic tombs. The territorial giants of northern England are associated with specific hilltops and cairns, and the wild moorland landscapes of Yorkshire and Cumbria. In each case, the giant is not a wandering figure from a generalized mythology. It is a specifically located being tied to a specific place in the real landscape. And in many cases, when you go to that place, there is something there. Not always a monument, sometimes a natural feature of striking character, a tor or a rock formation that seems too regular to be entirely natural. But often, especially in the lowland landscapes where Neolithic and Bronze Age construction was most intensive, there is a monument, a barrow, a circle, a standing stone, a chambered tomb, something built, something that had to be moved into position by people or beings of considerable capability. Something with an entrance or a chamber calibrated to a scale that is not quite average. Now I want to take you somewhere specific, somewhere you might not have heard of, because it is not on the usual tourist circuit and it doesn't have the dramatic visual impact of Stonehenge or the romance of Avebury. But it is, in many ways, the most instructive site for the argument we have been developing. Kit's Coty House, in the North Downs of Kent, is a portal dolmen, and it is extraordinary. It consists of 3 massive upright stones supporting a capstone of enormous weight. It is the remnant of a Neolithic long barrow that once stretched for perhaps 100 meters, now reduced by centuries of agriculture to its stone skeleton. The capstone, a single slab of local greensand, weighs approximately 8 tons. The uprights that support it are between 1 meter and 2 meters in height, above the current ground surface. And the opening created by the arrangement of uprights, the portal through which you would have entered the chamber beneath the capstone, has a height that is approximately 2 meters, or just over 6 feet. 2 meters, 6 feet. That is the height at which a modern person of tall but not exceptional stature can enter without ducking. It is not the height you would design a ceremonial threshold for a people averaging 5 feet 6, because the extra 15 centimeters of height above what such a person needs involves significantly more construction effort. The capstone has to be raised higher. The uprights have to be taller. The effort is proportional to the height, and additional height above functional necessity is additional effort for no practical return, unless the functional necessity is itself higher than standard. Next to Kit's Coty House, a few hundred meters along the ridge, there is a jumbled heap of large stones, known as the Countless Stones, or Little Kit's Coty. This is the remains of another portal dolmen, in a much more collapsed state. The stones are massive but disordered, fallen and scattered from their original arrangement. The local tradition about the Countless Stones is that they are uncountable, that any attempt to count them will always produce a different result. This is a piece of folklore that appears at several megalithic sites in Britain and has been reasonably interpreted as a warning. Don't try to understand these things by ordinary methods, because ordinary methods don't apply here. The monuments operate by a different logic, or, in a more literal reading, the folk tradition is encoding the memory that the original builders used a system of counting and measurement that was not the system of the people who came later. Because there is a real question about the metrology, the system of measurement, used in the construction of Britain's megalithic monuments. This question was famously explored by Alexander Thom, a Scottish engineer and surveyor who spent decades measuring megalithic sites across Britain and Ireland, and concluded, controversially but with considerable rigor, that the builders used a consistent unit of measurement he called the megalithic yard, approximately 82.9 centimeters in length. Thom's work was disputed, and the debate about the megalithic yard continues. But the underlying observation, that the megalithic monuments show geometric regularities that seem to reflect a consistent and sophisticated system of measurement, is hard to simply dismiss. A consistent measurement system means a society with the social organization and the continuity to maintain that system across multiple sites, across multiple generations, across what must have been a substantial geographic area. The megalithic yard, if it existed, appears in sites from Orkney to Brittany. That is not the reach of a local community. That is the reach of a culture. And a culture with a consistent measurement system, capable of maintaining that consistency across hundreds of miles and many generations, is not a collection of scattered farming communities, scratching a subsistence existence from reluctant soil. It is an organized civilization. An organized civilization of people about whose physical characteristics we have persistent, if fragmentary, evidence suggesting that they were larger than the people who came after them. At this point in the argument, I want to step back and address something honestly, because intellectual honesty requires it. Everything I have described tonight is real. The chamber heights are documented. The folklore is documented. The Victorian accounts of large bones are documented. The genetic population replacements are documented. The engineering problems of megalithic construction are real and not fully solved. The disappearance of specific skeletal specimens from institutional collections is documented. All of this is real. What is not real, or at least what is not yet established, is the specific claim that Britain's Neolithic populations included a significant proportion of individuals of exceptionally large stature, and that the architectural anomalies we have been examining reflect the physical reality of those individuals. That claim is the best interpretation of the evidence as I have presented it, but it is not the only interpretation, and in the spirit of fairness, we should acknowledge the alternatives. The alternative interpretations are several. The chamber heights are ceremonial and symbolic, not functional. The Victorian accounts of large bones are exaggerations or misidentifications, the natural enthusiasm of non-specialist observers confronted with the unfamiliar. The folk tradition of giant builders is a form of cargo mythology, the projection of superhuman capabilities onto builders who achieved extraordinary results through entirely human means. The missing bones are genuinely lost, not suppressed. All of these are reasonable positions. Professional archaeology holds them, and professional archaeology is not simply a machine for suppressing inconvenient truth. It is a discipline with rigorous methodological standards and a genuine commitment to evidence. But the methodological standards of professional archaeology are also designed to maintain a level of epistemic conservatism that, while generally useful, tends to filter out evidence that doesn't fit the established framework before that evidence has been fully examined. The disappearance of the physical specimens means that the evidence that would most directly confirm or refute the central claim is not available for re-examination using modern methods. We can't carbon date the York skeleton or sequence its DNA. We can't apply modern osteometric methods to Colt Hoare's Wiltshire giant. We have the documentary record, and the documentary record is suggestive, but not conclusive. What is not in dispute is that the doorways are still standing, and the doorways are tall, and the chambers are high, and those are physical facts that can be measured today, independently, by anyone who goes to the sites. They don't require Victorian documentation or institutional trust. They are there. They are measurable, and they don't fully make sense in the context of a population averaging 5 feet 6. Let us spend some time now with a group of sites that don't get nearly enough attention in the mainstream discussion of British prehistory, but which are directly relevant to what we have been exploring. The rock-cut chambers of southern Britain. These are not the famous megalithic tombs. They are not the great stone circles. They are caves and chamber systems cut into the soft limestone and chalk of the southern English landscape, in some cases clearly natural features that were modified and used by prehistoric populations, in other cases apparently entirely artificial, cut from the living rock using stone tools. Their dates are disputed, and in many cases uncertain, because rock-cut chambers do not contain the organic materials that give us radiocarbon dates, and the objects found within them are often secondary deposits, things left there at a later date than the cutting of the chamber itself. The Royston Cave in Hertfordshire is one of these. It is a bell-shaped chamber cut into the chalk beneath the town of Royston, discovered in 1742 when a workman digging for a post encountered the roof of the cavity. The chamber is roughly 5 meters deep, roughly 3.5 meters in diameter, and is covered from floor to ceiling with carved figures, symbolic motifs, and a complex iconographic program that has been variously attributed to the Knights Templar, to medieval hermits, to Romano-British religious practitioners, and to prehistoric ritual use. The carvings include figures of unusual proportions, some of which scholars have noted are taller than the standard human figure of the period would suggest. The chamber itself is high enough for a person of above average height to move within it without difficulty. The West Wycombe Caves in Buckinghamshire, known today primarily as the Hellfire Caves and associated with the Libertine Club of the 18th century, run for a quarter of a mile through the chalk hillside and incorporate chambers of considerable height. The caves were substantially modified and extended in the 18th century to their current form, but the core of the system is older, and local tradition associates the deepest and highest ceiling chambers with pre-Christian ritual use of uncertain antiquity. The chalk of the West Wycombe area has been worked for millennia. The question of when the original cave system was begun and by whom is genuinely open. The Chislehurst Caves in Kent are a network of approximately 13,000 square feet of tunnels and chambers cut into the chalk of the North Downs. They were mined commercially for chalk and flint from medieval times, and portions of the system were certainly extended in the 18th and 19th centuries. But the deepest sections, the oldest feeling parts of the system, show cutting techniques and tool marks that differ from those of the documented modern periods. The chambers in these older sections are, in several cases, notably taller than the mining tunnels that connect them. They have the feel of spaces designed for habitation rather than extraction, a different spatial logic than the corridors and stopes of a chalk mine. None of this is conclusive. The Chislehurst Caves, Royston Cave, the West Wycombe system, all of these are genuinely ambiguous sites whose full history is not established, but they are part of a pattern of subterranean and semi-subterranean spaces in the British landscape, whose proportions exceed what functional necessity obviously requires. And they sit alongside the megalithic chambers, which are also subterranean or semi-subterranean, and which also exceed functional necessity in their internal dimensions. The pattern is not in any one site. The pattern is in the totality of evidence across all the sites, across all the periods, across all the different types of tradition, documentary, architectural, folkloric, genetic. None of it, individually, is conclusive. Taken together, it is more than the sum of its parts. Let us now turn to a very different kind of evidence, one that rarely enters the mainstream discussion of prehistoric Britain, but which is directly relevant to the physical capabilities of the people we are discussing. The evidence from physical trauma. When skeletal remains from Neolithic and Bronze Age Britain are examined by bioarchaeologists, one of the things they look for is evidence of injury and trauma. And what they find, in a significant proportion of the remains, is evidence of injuries that we associate with very high physical activity levels. Stress fractures in the long bones, degenerative changes in joints consistent with heavy repetitive loading, enthesopathy, the calcification of muscle attachment points that indicates sustained high-level muscle use. These are the bodies of people who used their physical capabilities intensively. The pattern of enthesopathy in Neolithic British skeletal remains is particularly notable in the upper body, the shoulders, arms and hands, in a way that is consistent with the lifting and positioning of heavy objects. These were people whose muscles were developed through work that involved moving large and heavy things. Not just farming, not just the ordinary physical work of a subsistence agricultural community. Something more demanding. The kind of work that builds the kind of body that leaves the kind of skeletal marks these bones show. This does not tell us about stature. Enthesopathy and stress injury don't scale reliably with height, but they do tell us about the physical culture of the Neolithic population. These were strong people, physically capable people, people whose work required sustained high levels of muscular effort. And a population in which this kind of intense physical development was normal is a population whose physical capabilities for large-scale construction were considerably greater than we typically imagine when we picture a short, slight, Neolithic farmer. The combination of unusual stature in some individuals, intense physical development across the population, and the consistent folklore tradition of exceptional builders begins to form a picture of a Neolithic British population that was, in at least some respects, physically exceptional by modern standards. There is one more thread in the physical evidence that we should pull before we turn to the wider implications of everything we have been discussing. And this thread involves the tools. The stone tools of the British Neolithic are well studied. We know the types, the techniques, the raw materials, the distribution patterns. The British Neolithic flint industry was sophisticated, producing blades, scrapers, arrowheads, axes, and a range of specialized tools with considerable skill. But there is a category of Neolithic tool that raises a specific question about the physical scale of its user: stone axes. Not the small hand axes of the lower Paleolithic, which were hand-held cutting implements. The larger ground stone axes of the Neolithic, which were hafted with wooden handles and used for tree felling and heavy woodworking. The Neolithic axes found in Britain range considerably in size. The smaller ones are within the range that a modern adult of average size handles comfortably. But the larger ones are something else. The Great Langdale Axe Factory in the Lake District produced some of the largest stone axes in Britain. Langdale axes were traded across the island, found in contexts hundreds of miles from their source, suggesting they were valued objects that travelled through exchange networks. Some of them are large, not uniformly, but in a meaningful proportion of cases. The Langdale axes recovered from archaeological contexts are sized for hands larger than those of an average modern adult. The hafting angle, the balance, the grip, all of these things can be inferred from the shape of the axe head, and in the larger examples, the physical characteristics that produce an effective grip are those of a hand noticeably bigger than average. This argument from tool ergonomics is inexact. Tool size doesn't map reliably onto user size across cultures and contexts. Some large tools are meant to be held two-handed. Some are designed for specific tasks that require leverage rather than grip. But the pattern of consistently oversized tools in specific categories, combined with all the other evidence, adds another small weight to the scales. Now, let us take a step back from the specific evidence and think about the deeper question this whole subject raises. If there were people of unusual stature in prehistoric Britain who built monuments of extraordinary scale and precision, and who left behind both an architectural legacy and a persistent folk memory, what happened to them? Where did they go? And what does their disappearance tell us about the history of this island? The genetic evidence we discussed earlier offers one part of the answer. The population replacement events of the Neolithic and Bronze Age were dramatic and comprehensive. The Anatolian-derived farming population largely replaced the hunter-gatherers. The steppe-derived Beaker people largely replaced the Anatolian farmers. These were not gentle absorptions. They were, in the genetic record, something closer to population replacements, with the incoming populations making up the overwhelming majority of the post-replacement gene pool. If the Neolithic population included individuals of unusual stature, and if those individuals' physical characteristics were to any significant degree genetically determined, then the replacement of the Neolithic population by the Beaker people would have substantially reduced the frequency of those characteristics in the subsequent population. This is what geneticists call a demographic bottleneck effect operating through population replacement. The physical characteristics of the replaced population don't simply disappear into the new gene pool in proportion to their previous frequency. They can be diluted to insignificance within a relatively small number of generations, especially if the physical characteristic was concentrated in a specific segment of the Neolithic population rather than distributed across it. If the unusually tall individuals were, for example, a socially distinct subset of the Neolithic population, an elite, or a priestly class, or a group with special social roles, and if that subset did not contribute disproportionately to the genetic ancestry of the post-Neolithic population, then their physical characteristics would vanish from the record even more rapidly than the average Neolithic physical type. The mythological record, interestingly, supports something like this reading. In the traditions we have been discussing, the giants and the tall ones and the old ones are consistently presented as a people apart. They are not the common folk. They are the builders, the priests, the kings, the divine beings. They occupy the top of whatever social hierarchy exists. And in traditions where one group of beings is replaced by another, it is typically the elite that disappears most completely. The common people absorb into the new order. The elite, defined by their specialness and their distinction, have nowhere to go. They are too different from the incoming population to be absorbed. They die out, or they retreat. In the mythological traditions of Britain and Ireland, this retreat is narrated directly. The Tuatha De Danann go underground. They enter the Sidhe, the hollow hills, the chambered mounds. They become the fairy people, hidden within the landscape, invisible to ordinary perception, present but not present. What this mythological retreat narrates may be the historical reality of a population displacement. The older people, the tall people, the builders, retreating into the monuments they had built as the new people arrived and took over the landscape, retreating, ultimately, into memory, into the folk tradition, into the name attached to every tumbled cairn and every oversized doorway in the British countryside. There is a beautiful and slightly heartbreaking symmetry to this. The same people who built the chambers for their dead ended up in the mythology becoming the dead who inhabit the chambers. The houses they built for their ancestors became the homes attributed to them in the stories told by the people who came after. The architecture survived. The people who built it were folded into the architecture itself, transformed from builders to inhabitants, from the living to the legendary. This is perhaps what folk memory does. It takes the people who disappeared and gives them a place to remain. Not in the world of the living, but in the world of the monument, in the hill, in the mound, in the stone. In the doorway that is still tall enough, 6,000 years later, to admit a figure of considerable stature, if the figure were there to walk through it. Let us go back to the beginning, because we have been a long way from where we started. There is a doorway in the north of England that has been standing for so long that nobody alive today knows who built it. That was where we started. But now we know, or at least we have considerably more to work with than we did. We know that the doorway was built by people whose genetic ancestry has been substantially reconstructed through ancient DNA studies, and who came originally from Anatolia by way of the European continent. We know that those people built across Britain for over 1,000 years before being largely replaced by a new population from the eastern steppes. We know that their monuments are consistently larger than the people of average Neolithic height strictly required, and that the excess of scale is most visible in the internal dimensions of chambers and the heights of passages and portal openings. We know that Victorian excavators repeatedly found and documented skeletal remains of unusual size from Neolithic and Bronze Age contexts, and that those remains have largely vanished from accessible collections. We know that the folk tradition of every region of Britain consistently attributes the construction of megalithic monuments to beings of extraordinary stature. And we know that the mythology of the peoples who came after consistently describes the builders as retreating underground into the monuments themselves when the world changed around them. None of this, taken individually, is a proof. But taken together, it amounts to something that deserves more serious attention than it currently receives in mainstream discussions of British prehistory. The question of who built Britain's oldest doorways, and what scale of being those doorways were built for, is not a settled question. It is an open question. And open questions, in a landscape as ancient and as rich as Britain's, deserve to be sat with. Let me tell you about a specific place where you can sit with it. Wayland Smithy, on the Ridgeway in Oxfordshire, is one of the most atmospheric megalithic sites in Britain. It is approached along the ancient Ridgeway trackway, which runs along the crest of the Berkshire Downs and is itself ancient enough to predate the monuments along its route. Wayland Smithy sits in a grove of old beech trees, their roots gripping the chalk and their canopy, creating a green vault overhead in summer, a skeletal cage in winter. The monument itself is a long barrow with an elaborate stone facade, constructed around 3590 BCE, which makes it roughly contemporary with the earliest phases of Avebury and slightly older than Stonehenge's first phase. The facade consists of 4 large sarsen stones, creating a forecourt area in front of the entrance. The entrance itself is formed by 2 tall upright sarsens with a large capstone. Behind the entrance, a passage leads into the mound, with 2 pairs of side chambers created by transverse stones and a terminal chamber at the far end. The passage is, by the measurements I have been referring to throughout this discussion, tall enough for a person of 6 feet to walk through with moderate comfort, and tall enough for a person of 7 feet to walk through with some care. The name Wayland Smithy is not prehistoric. It is Saxon, dating to the period after the Anglo-Saxon settlement of Britain in the 5th and 6th centuries CE, when the monument was already over 4,000 years old. Wayland is the divine smith of Norse and Germanic mythology, a figure of extraordinary skill and power who forges magical weapons and armor in his underground forge. The Saxons arriving in this landscape encountering this ancient stone structure in its beech grove on the ridge, attributed it to Wayland because it seemed to them the kind of place where a divine smith might work. The connection is mythological rather than historical, but it reflects the same impulse we have been tracing all evening. The association of the oldest and most impressive structures with beings of unusual capability and, implicitly, unusual scale. If you go to Wayland's Smithy on a quiet morning, before the tourists arrive, and while the mist is still lying in the valley below the ridge, you can stand at the entrance to the passage and look in. The beech trees stand around you. The chalk downland stretches away in both directions along the ridgeway. The sky is pale and wide above the mound, and the entrance is just tall enough to make you wonder. Not so tall as to be obviously wrong, not so low as to be obviously right. Just that slight excess of height that makes you recalculate. That makes you think, who built this, and what were they? The stone doesn't answer. The stone never answers. But it keeps asking the question, 6,000 years on, to anyone who stands before it and is willing to be asked. Now, the question we have been exploring about Britain's ancient architecture and its relationship to human stature doesn't exist in isolation. It connects to a much broader global phenomenon, and it is worth spending time with some of those connections because they both reinforce and complicate the British evidence in interesting ways. The stone structures of Malta, built between 3,600 and 2,500 BCE, are older than the pyramids and contain some of the most precisely engineered interior spaces of any Neolithic monument. The Gantija temples on the island of Gozo, whose name translates as the Tower of the Giants, have main entrance thresholds that are consistently taller than a modern adult needs. The chambers inside are spacious. The corbelling of the walls is sophisticated. And the local Maltese tradition, recorded from medieval times onwards, attributes the construction of these temples to a race of giants who inhabited the islands before the current population. The name of the temples is the local folk memory made explicit in the architecture's label. The dolmens of the Caucasus Mountains, in what is now Georgia and the Russian Federation, are stone chamber structures built by a culture that archaeology places in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE. They are sometimes called the houses of the dwarfs in local tradition, reflecting a later people's attempt to explain who built them by imagining that the small entrances must have been designed for small people. But the chambers inside the dolmens are not small. The entrances are small, but the chambers are full-sized, sometimes quite large. The same design logic we see in Britain, a restricted entry opening into an unexpectedly spacious interior. And the local traditions in the Caucasus, alongside the dwarf interpretation, also include an older tradition of large builders, a people who had come from somewhere else, and who were not like the people of the surrounding landscape. The megalithic structures of Sardinia, the Nuraghi, are Bronze Age towers built from enormous blocks of local stone without mortar, their interior chambers corbelled in a way directly analogous to the Scottish and Irish chambered cairns. The Nuraghi interiors, while not all large, frequently have ground-floor chambers of considerable height, and the architecture of the vaulted ceilings is calculated with a precision that has impressed every structural engineer who has studied it. The Sardinian giant tradition, the Janas, the spirits of the megalithic period who inhabit the landscapes of ancient monuments, is among the most persistent and specific of any European megalithic tradition. In Sardinia, and in Malta, and in the Caucasus, and in Britain, the same architectural pattern and the same folk tradition appear. Oversized chambers, restricted entries, builders attributed in local memory to beings of unusual stature. The geographic spread rules out any kind of direct copying or cultural diffusion for the folk tradition, at least in its modern forms. These traditions developed independently in populations separated by sea and mountain, and yet they converge on the same description. What do you do with that convergence? The skeptic says that people naturally attribute impressive construction to beings more capable than themselves, that the giant builder tradition is a universal of folk response to impressive ancient architecture and doesn't require any factual content. That is a defensible position. But it requires you to explain why the architectural anomalies, the excess of scale, the chamber heights, the oversized portals, appear in the same sites that attract the giant tradition. If the folk tradition is a response to the architecture's impressiveness rather than a memory of the builder's size, why does that response consistently take the form of size attribution rather than, say, technological superiority attribution? Other ancient structures, the Roman roads, the medieval cathedrals, the Industrial Revolution infrastructure, are admired and found impressive by later populations, and those later populations explain them by reference to greater organization, greater technology, greater resource, but not consistently, by reference to greater physical stature. The size attribution is specific to a specific category of monument, and that specificity suggests it is encoding something real about the specific monuments it attaches to. We are not, to be clear, saying that the ancient Maltese, or the ancient British, or the ancient Caucasian builders were 8 or 10 feet tall. The mythology may exaggerate what the reality was. Folk memory has a tendency to amplify the remarkable characteristics of remembered figures, as anyone who has ever heard a fish story knows. But if the folk memory is amplifying a real characteristic, the real characteristic was there to be amplified. And the real characteristic, the thing being amplified into the giant tradition, was a physical stature that was considerably greater than the average of the populations that came after. Considerably greater is not 8 feet, but it might be 7 feet, or 6.5. In a world where the average is 5 feet 6, a population with a significant proportion of individuals at 6.5 to 7 feet would be remembered as giants by the people who encountered them or heard about them secondhand. The folk memory would exaggerate upward from there, generation by generation, until the memory of people who were a foot or 18 inches taller than average becomes the tradition of beings 20 feet tall. That is how memory works. That is how mythology works. It preserves the essential quality, the tallness, the bigness, the power, and amplifies it to make it memorable, to ensure it survives the centuries. What survives the centuries without amplification is the stone. The stone is not mythology. The stone does not exaggerate. The stone simply is what it is, measurable and real, in a field or a hilltop or a beech grove on a chalk ridge in Oxfordshire, waiting for someone to come and stand in the doorway and ask who built this, and why is it this tall? And what were the people who walked through here like, before the world changed around them and they disappeared into the hill? There is a man named Ross Hemsworth, a researcher and broadcaster based in Britain, who has spent years doing something that academic archaeologists tend not to do. He visits the sites with a tape measure, and he writes down the numbers, not the numbers from the excavation reports, which are sometimes given in approximations, or are focused on the overall monument dimensions rather than the interior spaces. The numbers from a tape measure held at head height, inside a chambered cairn, or placed against the entrance stones of a portal dolmen, or used to record the height of the passage in a long barrow from floor to ceiling at various points along its length. The resulting dataset, accumulated over many years of fieldwork, shows a consistent pattern that Hemsworth has documented in his published work and in numerous public presentations. The pattern is this. In Neolithic chambered tombs across Britain, the height of the interior spaces is, on average and with some variation, calibrated to a figure significantly above the Neolithic average height, as established by skeletal analysis. The passages are higher than they need to be, the chambers are higher than they need to be, and the excess of height is not random. It clusters in a way that suggests it reflects a specific stature range, rather than simply an architectural preference for impressive spaces. Now, Hemsworth is not a credentialed academic archaeologist, and his work sits outside the peer-reviewed literature. That should be noted. But the measurements he records are not interpretations. They are numbers. The numbers can be independently verified by anyone who visits the sites. And the pattern the numbers reveal is there for anyone to see, which means the question the numbers raise is a legitimate question, regardless of who is raising it. What was the intended functional height of these interior spaces? The academic answer, when it comes, is usually the ritual answer. The height is ceremonial. It creates a sense of awe. It makes the space feel sacred. And that may be true, as far as it goes. But sacredness and functionality are not mutually exclusive. A space can be built to both functional and ceremonial specifications simultaneously. The question of what functional specification drove the design doesn't go away just because the space also served ceremonial purposes. Let us take a specific example and examine it in detail. The Stony Littleton Long Barrow in Somerset, built around 3500 BCE, is a remarkably well-preserved Neolithic chamber tomb. It is accessible to the public, and the English heritage key can be borrowed from the nearby farm, which means you can actually go inside, which I strongly recommend. The entrance is a tall, somewhat irregular opening formed by two upright stones and a capstone. Once inside, the passage stretches back about 13 meters into the mound, with 3 pairs of side chambers opening from it and a terminal chamber at the far end. The passage height varies, but at its maximum, near the entrance, it is approximately 2 meters. The terminal chamber, the deepest and most interior space, is approximately 2.5 meters high at its highest point, that is over 8 feet. The side chambers vary from about 1.5 meters to nearly 2 meters in height. The entire interior space is one in which a person of 6 feet can move with complete comfort, and a person of 6.5 feet would need only minimal adjustment of posture in the lower portions. For a monument built for a population averaging 5 feet 7, this represents a consistent excess of interior height. The excess is not dramatic. It is not the 20 feet of Newgrange's Great Chamber, but it is there, and it is consistent, and it is present in a monument that is modest in scale by the standards of Neolithic Britain, which suggests that the excess of height is not a function of architectural ambition, but of practical specification. The Stony Littleton Long Barrow is in a beautiful setting, in a fold of the Somerset Hills with pasture around it and a stream nearby. When you emerge from the interior into the Somerset morning, after an hour in the chamber, the light hits you differently. Something has happened in there. Something to do with time and scale and the sense of presence that old stone accumulates. The chamber was last used for burial in the Neolithic period. Nobody has inhabited it since. And yet it doesn't feel empty. It feels as if it is still expecting someone of a particular height. Let me tell you about the Bath area, because the Bath area is one of the richest concentrations of anomalous sites in southern Britain, and it doesn't receive nearly the attention it deserves in this context. The Roman baths in Bath sit on top of a pre-Roman sacred hot spring. The Romans called the spring Aquae Sulis, the waters of Sulis, Sulis being the local deity of the spring who the Romans syncretized with their own Minerva. The cult of Sulis Minerva was important enough to support a substantial temple complex and a significant priestly establishment. But the spring itself, and the ritual veneration of springs as sacred places, goes back far before the Romans. Hot springs in Britain were sacred long before the Romans arrived, and the Bath Spring, being one of the hottest and most dramatic in the country, was almost certainly a focus of ritual activity in the Neolithic and Bronze Age. What is interesting in the context of our discussion is the tradition attached to the Bath area in the centuries after the Romans left. Geoffrey of Monmouth, in his History of the Kings of Britain, writes extensively about Bath and its hot springs, and he includes in his account a reference to the earlier inhabitants of the area as people of great size and power. This is Geoffrey's standard mode of mythologizing the distant past, and we should treat it as such. But the specific localization to Bath is notable. Geoffrey is not applying a generic giant tradition to an arbitrary location. He is applying it to a specific place that has a specific history of pre-Roman sacred significance, and which has, within walking distance, some of the most impressive megalithic monuments in Britain. The Stanton stone circles, just 6 miles south of Bath, are the third largest megalithic circle complex in Britain, behind only Avebury and the Rollright stones. The main circle at Stanton is nearly 113 meters in diameter, only slightly smaller than Avebury's outer circle. The stones are sandstone and have weathered badly, many now lying recumbent or heavily damaged by lichen and frost action. But ground-penetrating radar survey, carried out in the late 1990s, revealed that the standing stones were the remnant of a much more complex original monument, with evidence of a large timber circle and a substantial enclosure within the stone circles, creating a layered, sacred space of considerable complexity. The scale of Stanton is extraordinary for a site that most visitors to Bath don't know exists. It receives a fraction of the tourist traffic of Stonehenge or Avebury, which means that on most days you can stand among its stones in something approaching solitude and take in the full weight of what you are in the presence of. These stones, however weathered, are Neolithic megaliths of the first order. They were moved here and arranged here by people who had both the social organization to coordinate the labor and the intellectual program to specify the design. And the design is calibrated to the same horizon of ambition that we find at the other major Neolithic sites. Local tradition about Stanton Drew involves, as you would expect by now, a giant. In one version, the circles were created by a giant woman who danced the village into stone after they refused to stop their revelry on the Sabbath. In another and older version, the stones mark the graves of a race of tall people who inhabited the valley before the current village. The older version, as is typically the case, has the more structural content. It is not explaining the monument symbolically, with the stone dance story, but descriptively, with the burial of tall people story. Something that is not about moral teaching, but about historical memory. We should also visit Glastonbury, because Glastonbury is inescapable in any discussion of the ancient mysteries of Somerset, and because, beneath its elaborate overlay of Arthurian romance and New Age spirituality, there are some genuinely interesting archaic elements that bear directly on our question. The Glastonbury Tor is a naturally stepped hill that rises strikingly from the flat Somerset levels. Its summit has been occupied since at least the Iron Age, and possibly much earlier. The terraces on its flanks, which are visible from miles away, have been the subject of considerable debate. Some archaeologists interpret them as the result of strip farming in the medieval period. Others, including the scholar Geoffrey Ashe, who spent decades studying Glastonbury's myths and archaeology, argue that the terracing is pre-medieval, possibly pre-Roman, and may represent a deliberately constructed labyrinthine path around the tor that had a ritual function. The dimensions and geometry of the terracing, if it is artificial, represent a considerable engineering undertaking, and the scale of the project, modifying the entire hillside of a conspicuous landscape feature, is consistent with the kind of ambitious Neolithic or Bronze Age monument construction we have been discussing. What is particularly interesting is the tradition associated with the tor in the oldest recorded sources. The Welsh medieval literature records that Glastonbury, the place called Ynys Wyttrin, the Isle of Glass, was associated with the otherworld, with a realm of beings who were different from ordinary humans and who inhabited the landscape in a different way. The connections to Arthur and to the fairy world are well known. Less well known is the specific tradition, recorded in some versions of the Arthurian cycle, that the beings who inhabited Glastonbury's sacred precinct were of unusual physical stature. This detail gets lost in the more romantic and allegorical treatments of the Arthurian material. But in the older, raw versions of the tradition, the otherworldly beings are not just mysterious, they are large. This is consistent with what we have seen everywhere else in the British landscape. The sacred places, the places where the old beings lived or were buried or retreated to, are marked by two things: architecture that exceeds the scale of the ordinary, and traditions of inhabitants who exceeded the scale of the ordinary people who came later. Let us spend some time now with the specific question of what happened in the Bronze Age. Because the Bronze Age transition is directly relevant to the disappearance of whatever population or population subset was responsible for the Neolithic monument tradition, the arrival of the beaker culture in Britain, around 2400 BCE, is now understood through the ancient DNA evidence as a major demographic event. The beaker people, who brought with them metalworking, a new type of pottery, a new set of burial practices involving individual graves rather than collective chamber tombs, and apparently a substantially different social organization, replaced the existing Neolithic population to an extent that the genetics show clearly. Within a few centuries, the descendants of the beaker incomers dominated the British gene pool. What happened to the Neolithic population? Some were absorbed, some died. Some may have fled to marginal areas where the beaker expansion reached more slowly. The pattern of population replacement in the ancient DNA record doesn't require violent genocide, though violence certainly occurred in some cases. It can result from differential fertility, disease, economic marginalization, and the gradual demographic absorption of a smaller population into a larger one over multiple generations. However it happened, the result was clear. By the middle of the Bronze Age, the people who had built the Neolithic monuments were mostly gone, and with them, apparently, went the tradition of building large megalithic chambers. The Bronze Age burial tradition in Britain is almost entirely round barrows containing individual inhumations or cremations. No more collective chamber tombs. No more oversized passages and high-ceilinged interior spaces. The burial architecture of the Bronze Age is scaled differently, more modestly, more individually. Whatever was driving the Neolithic builders to create the scale of interior space they consistently created, that driving force disappeared with the Neolithic population. This is circumstantial, but circumstantial evidence, when it points consistently in one direction, accumulates into something meaningful. The Neolithic population built in a particular way. They built large, with emphasis on interior height and scale. They were replaced by a different population who built in a different way, smaller and more individually scaled. The change in building practice correlates precisely with the change in population, and the folk traditions that attribute the older architecture to a different kind of people, specifically a larger kind, are consistent with the genetic evidence that the older architecture was built by a different kind of people. A different kind of people who were replaced, who retreated into the hills and the stones and the stories, and who left behind doorways that are still, 6,000 years later, just a little taller than they need to be. There is something I want to tell you about the Roman period in Britain that tends to get left out of the standard history and which is directly relevant to the physical scale question we have been following all evening. When the Romans arrived in Britain in 43 CE, they encountered a population that was not, by Roman standards, small. The Britons described by Roman writers were, on average, taller than the Romans they fought. Julius Caesar, writing about his expeditions to Britain in 55 and 54 BCE, described the Britons as large-bodied and fierce. Tacitus, writing in the Agricola about the conquest of the north of Britain, described the Caledonians of Scotland as large-limbed and red-haired, clearly physically distinct from the populations of southern Britain, and both groups larger than the average Roman soldier. This is not myth. This is contemporary military reporting. The Roman writers were describing people they had actually seen and fought. The skeletal evidence from Roman Britain supports this. When bioarchaeologists analyze the bones of Romano-British individuals, they find a population that is, on average, taller than the preceding Bronze Age populations. Not dramatically taller, but consistently taller. The average height of a Romano-British male is typically given as around 5 feet 7 to 5 feet 9, taller than the Neolithic average, taller than the Roman average. And within that population, the range of individual variation is wide enough that very tall individuals, 6 feet and above, are not rare. What this tells us is that by the Roman period, Britain's population already showed evidence of the physical characteristics that the folk tradition associates with the older builders. Not the full size of the mythological giants, obviously, but a tendency toward taller stature than the continental average, perhaps reflecting a partial genetic inheritance from the Neolithic and pre-Neolithic populations, filtered through the various demographic replacements of the intervening millennia. The giants were gone, in whatever literal sense they had existed, but they had left something behind in the physical type of the island's inhabitants, and in some specific cases, they had apparently left something more dramatic. The Roman fort at Binchester, in County Durham, has been the site of ongoing archaeological excavation for many years. Binchester, the Roman Vinovia, was a substantial installation on the Roman road network in the north of England, associated with the 6th Legion. Excavations at Binchester have recovered a wide range of skeletal material from the associated cemetery, and the skeletal material has been analysed with modern bioarchaeological methods. Most of the Binchester individuals fall within the expected range for Romano-British and Roman military populations, but within the dataset, there are outliers, individuals whose skeletal dimensions suggest a living height considerably above the population average. The largest individual identified in the Binchester skeletal assemblage has been estimated, from long bone measurements, to have stood at approximately 6 feet 7 inches in life. This is not 8 feet. It is not the stuff of mythology, but it is a very tall person by any historical standard, and it is a very tall person whose bones were found in a Roman period cemetery in the north of England. The individual's genetic ancestry has not been determined. We don't know if they were a Roman soldier from an unusually tall population, or a local Briton, or something in between, but they were there, they were real, and they were very tall. This is a single data point, not a pattern in itself, but it sits in a context that by now is familiar. A location in the north of England associated with significant archaeological activity, a large individual who stands out from the population around them. A real, measurable fact about a real body that is now preserved in an accessible collection rather than lost to the usual archival entropy. The Binchester individual, at 6'7", is within the range of tall but not extraordinary modern people. But in a world where the average is 5'7", a person of 6'7" is a foot taller than average. Scale that to a Neolithic population where the average might have been 5'5", and a person a foot taller than average is 6'5". A person a foot and a half taller is 7 feet. These are not giants, they are people. But they are people whose physical scale would have left an impression, and whose physical requirements in terms of built space would have exceeded the standard specifications of the population they lived among. This is, I think, the most honest and most accurate way to frame the argument we have been building all evening. Not giants. Not mythological beings. Not extraterrestrial interventions. But people. Real people of real flesh and bone who were, in some proportion of their population, significantly taller than average, and whose built environment reflected that physical reality in ways that are still measurable 6,000 years later. The mythology amplified this into giants. The institutional archaeology suppressed or lost the physical evidence. The folk tradition preserved the memory, and the stone preserved the dimensions. Now let us talk about something that has been sitting at the edge of our conversation for a while and deserves to be brought into the center. The possibility that the presence of tall individuals in Neolithic Britain reflects not a local genetic variant, but a connection to a wider and possibly older population that was distributed across a larger geographic area. The pre-Neolithic inhabitants of Britain, the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, were largely replaced by the incoming Neolithic farmers, but not entirely. The genetic studies show a small but persistent contribution from the Mesolithic hunter-gatherer population in the post-Neolithic gene pool, and the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers of Europe were, on average, taller than the Neolithic farmers who replaced them. The Cro-Magnon and subsequent Upper Paleolithic populations of Europe, whose skeletal remains span from roughly 40,000 years ago to the beginning of the Neolithic, include some of the tallest individuals in the entire prehistoric record. Cro-Magnon man, the type specimen found in 1,868 inches, the Dordogne, stood approximately 5 feet 11. Other Upper Paleolithic specimens from sites across Europe suggest a population with a mean height considerably above the Neolithic average. This population, the tall, gracile hunter-gatherers of Upper Paleolithic Europe, was largely absorbed and replaced by the incoming Neolithic farmers. But the replacement was not total. Their genes persisted, in reduced proportion, in the new mixed population, and if some of their physical characteristics, including the tendency toward taller stature, were genetically contributed to subsequent generations, then the tall individuals who show up in the Barrow literature and the skeletal record of Neolithic and Bronze Age Britain may be the visible expression of that contribution. The old genes surfacing in the new population, producing, in some individuals, a physical type that recalled the older inhabitants of the island. This is a speculative framework, but a scientifically coherent one. The genetic admixture of different populations with different mean heights produces, in the mixed population, a wider range of individual variation than either parental population showed alone. Some individuals will be shorter than either parental average. Some will be taller. And, in a population already carrying genes from a tall Upper Paleolithic ancestry, combined with additional genetic contributions from the tall steppe-derived populations who arrived in the Bronze Age, the probability of occasional very tall individuals is higher than it would be in a population with no such ancestry. Britain, as it happens, is exactly the kind of genetic crossroads where such mixing would produce exceptional individual variation. 3 major population waves in the prehistoric period, each bringing different physical characteristics, combined in an island environment where the mixing was intensified by geographic isolation. The island is a genetic crucible. And in crucibles, you get unusual results. The unusual results are the tall individuals documented in the Barrow literature. The unusual results are the bones that made Victorian antiquarians pause and reach for their measuring tapes and write careful notes about exceptional size. The unusual results are the men whose thigh bones suggest a living height of 7 feet or more, whose remains were forwarded to London and subsequently misplaced. The unusual results are, in the end, the doorways. The doorways that are still a little too tall for the people who average 5 feet 9, still calibrated to something that no longer exists in the landscape, but which was once real enough to design a building for. Let us think about the long Barrow tradition one more time before we start pulling the threads of this evening together. Because there is one aspect of the long Barrow tradition that we haven't fully examined, and it is in some ways the most revealing. Long barrows are not just burial monuments. They are, or they were, active places used repeatedly over long periods. The Neolithic practice of collective burial, the accumulation of multiple individuals' remains in a single chamber, continued over generations, and sometimes over centuries. Remains were added to chambers. Old bones were moved to make room for new ones. The chambers were reopened, revisited, maintained. The monument was a living focus of the community's relationship with its ancestors, not a one-time act of burial, but an ongoing practice of engagement with the dead. This means that the chambers were designed to be reusable. They were designed to accommodate repeated entry and use by the living. They were not sealed spaces intended only for the dead. They were accessible, navigable, usable interiors that the community returned to regularly for whatever rituals the engagement with ancestral remains required. And if they were regularly used by the living, then their dimensions, specifically their interior height and the height of their entrances and passages, were designed with the living in mind, as well as the dead. A chamber that is designed for repeated use by living people of a given height needs to be at least as tall as those people. The excess of height above the practical minimum is, in this context, even more telling than it would be in a purely funerary space. You don't need 8 feet of headroom in a chamber that you only enter once, ever, to place the dead. You only need 8 feet of headroom in a chamber that living people of 8 feet, or approaching 8 feet, enter regularly to perform their rituals. Or, to state it more conservatively, you need more than 6 feet of headroom in a chamber that living people of more than 6 feet enter regularly. And the evidence, the measurements, the consistent patterns across dozens of sites says that the chambers are more than 6 feet high, consistently, deliberately, by design. The design encoded the physical reality of the designers. The stone preserved the design. The stone is still standing. And the question the stone asks is one that the evidence is steadily and uncomfortably moving toward an answer to. Now let us follow a different thread for a while, because we have been talking primarily about the structural evidence and the documentary evidence, and there is a third kind of evidence that we haven't spent enough time with: the art. Neolithic and Bronze Age Britain produced very little representational art, at least in forms that have survived. There are carved symbols, cup and ring marks, geometric designs, spirals and chevrons, and concentric circles, found on stones at many of the major sites and at smaller, less visited locations across the upland landscapes of Britain. These symbols are not representational in the sense of showing people or animals, but at a few sites, there are representations of human figures that are relevant to our discussion. Folkestone in Yorkshire, where 3 carved chalk cylinders known as the Folkestone drums were found in the grave of a child, dating to around 2400 BCE, late Neolithic to early Bronze Age, are decorated with stylized human faces. The faces are carved with considerable skill, abstract but recognizable as faces, with features that include eyes and eyebrows and, in some interpretations, a nose. The Folkestone drums are famous in British archaeology and widely reproduced in books about prehistory. What is less often discussed is their size. The Folkestone drums are large. The largest is about 14.5 centimeters in diameter and about 10 centimeters high. For carved chalk objects found in a child's grave, they are substantial pieces. The stylized faces on them are proportioned in a way that has led some researchers to describe them as representing adults rather than children, even though they were buried with a child. And the faces, whatever stylization is applied to them, have a quality of presence that makes them feel like portraits of specific people rather than generic symbolic representations. If they are portraits, they tell us something. The bone structure of the faces is strong, the brow ridge prominent, the facial features set in proportions that suggest a substantial cranium. This is, as I said, very speculative, and the stylization of the art makes any reading of physical characteristics extremely uncertain. But the Folkestone drums, alongside the other carved chalk objects from the Yorkshire Wolds Neolithic, suggest a community that was interested in representing the human face and that had a specific vision of what that face looked like, a vision worth making permanent in carved chalk. There are also the chalk figurines, small representations of human form found at several Neolithic sites in southern England. The most famous are the Grimes Graves figurines from Norfolk, found in the flint mines at Grimes Graves in the late 19th century. These are small chalk carvings of female figures, stylized in ways that emphasize certain physical characteristics, and they have been compared to the European Paleolithic Venus figurines in their exaggeration of particular bodily features. What is relevant here is that some of the Grimes Graves figurines show proportions that, when read as representations of specific body types, suggest individuals of above-average height with correspondingly robust physical development. This is again speculative. Art is art, and the relationship between artistic representation and physical reality is never straightforward. But when the art, the architecture, the documents, the folklore, and the genetics all point in the same direction, speculative becomes suggestive, and suggestive becomes, after sufficient accumulation, a hypothesis worth taking seriously. There is a connection between what we have been exploring in Britain and a parallel body of evidence from North America that has been discussed and debated for decades, and which adds a significant and often overlooked dimension to the global picture. The Adena and Hopewell cultures of the Ohio Valley, dating from roughly 1000 BCE to 700 CE, built mound complexes of extraordinary scale and sophistication. The Newark earthworks in Ohio, the Great Serpent Mound, the Poverty Point complex in Louisiana, which is actually older, dating to 1700 BCE, these are among the largest prehistoric earthworks anywhere in the world. The Poverty Point earthwork complex involves the movement of an estimated 35 million cubic feet of earth, arranged in a series of concentric ridges forming a complex geometric pattern. 35 million cubic feet of earth moved without metal tools, without wheels, without draft animals, in a pre-ceramic culture in what is now the American South. The people who built these earthworks were not primitive. They maintained trade networks that stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes, from the Atlantic coast to the Rocky Mountain foothills. They worked copper, mica, obsidian, and marine shells, all traded over distances of hundreds or thousands of miles. They had astronomical knowledge sophisticated enough to align their earthworks with solar and lunar cycles in ways that still impress archaeologists. And in the burial mounds associated with these cultures, the skeletal evidence has been the subject of the most sustained and systematic suppression of any archaeological evidence in American history. The Smithsonian Institution, from the 1880s onward, sent agents to the Ohio Valley and surrounding regions to excavate Adena and Hopewell mounds. The reports produced by these surveys, published in the Bureau of Ethnology annual reports, are detailed and careful, and they document, repeatedly, the discovery of skeletal remains of unusual size. The 1882 report on the mound explorations by Cyrus Thomas contains multiple references to large bones from mound contexts. Thomas records femur lengths that would imply living heights of over 7 feet. He records skulls of unusual size. He records individuals buried with grave goods that suggest high social status and physical impressiveness. And then, the bones went to the Smithsonian, and the bones vanished. Jim Vieira, a stonemason and researcher from Massachusetts, spent years compiling newspaper accounts from the 19th and early 20th centuries, describing the discovery of oversized skeletal remains from burial mounds across the eastern United States. His catalogue runs to hundreds of individual cases, each with a specific location, a specific date, specific witnesses, and specific measurements. The catalogue is available in his published work and in the documentary series he made with Hugh Newman. The sheer volume of independent documentation from newspapers across every state of the Midwest and Northeast, from Ohio to Wisconsin to New York, from Minnesota to Tennessee, makes the possibility of wholesale fabrication implausible. These were not stories circulating in a credulous fringe press. They were news reports in the mainstream local newspapers of their time, written by reporters who had seen the bones and spoken to the excavators. The connection to Britain is not incidental. The burial mound tradition, the earthwork tradition, and the presence of large skeletal remains are documented on both sides of the Atlantic. The Atlantic is wide, and any direct connection between the builders of Britain's megalithic monuments and the builders of North America's earthwork complexes would require a chronological and geographic reach that is difficult to establish. But the parallel is striking enough to be worth noting. What both traditions share is a model of ancient construction by people of unusual physical capability, followed by a replacement or displacement of those people by later populations of more average physical type, followed by a systematic disappearance of the physical evidence from institutional collections, followed by the persistence in folk tradition of the memory of a tall and powerful people who were there before. The template is the same on both sides of the ocean. The details differ. The skeleton of the pattern is identical. One possible explanation for this global pattern, and it is the most conservative explanation available, is that the world's prehistoric populations included a wider range of physical variation than current skeletal databases suggest, and that the sampling biases of 19th and 20th century excavation tended to select against the anomalous remains that complicated the emerging narrative of steady human physical improvement from primitive to modern. The bones were there. The records show they were there. And the official institutions, for reasons that range from simple incompetence to institutional self-interest to something more deliberate, failed to preserve them in accessible form. The less conservative explanation, which the totality of the evidence pushes toward but cannot fully establish, is that the prehistoric world included populations with a significantly higher mean stature than current skeletal datasets suggest, and that these populations were responsible for some of the most impressive construction achievements in human prehistory, and that their physical reality was preserved in the folk traditions of the peoples who came after them in the form of the giant tradition, which is global, consistent, geographically specific, architecturally grounded, and stubbornly persistent across every civilization that has left a record. I am not going to tell you which explanation is correct. I can't tell you, because the physical evidence that would settle the question has been systematically removed from the accessible record. What I can tell you is that the question is real, the evidence is real, and the answer matters. It matters because our understanding of human prehistory shapes our understanding of human capability. If the people who built Stonehenge and Avebury and Wayland's Smithy and Maeshowe were physically exceptional in ways that the current skeletal averages don't capture, then the story of human physical development is more complex than we thought, and the capabilities required for the construction projects of the ancient world may have been more available than the standard narrative assumes. It matters because the suppression of evidence, whatever its mechanism, represents a failure of the institutional commitment to truth that academic disciplines claim as their highest value. It matters because the folk traditions of the people who live next to these monuments deserve to be taken seriously as repositories of real information about real history, rather than dismissed as primitive imagination. And it matters because the doorways are still standing. There is one more category of evidence that I want to bring to your attention before we begin to draw the threads of this evening together. And it is, in some ways, the most direct evidence of all, because it is not about the monuments or the folklore or the bones in the barrows. It is about the living landscape itself. There are places in Britain where the ground itself reveals the presence of large-bodied people. The trackways, the ancient road networks of Britain, the prehistoric paths that have been used continuously from the Neolithic to the present, are engineered for a specific kind of walking. The Ridgeway, the Pilgrim's Way, the Harrow Way, the Icknield Way. These ancient trackways run along ridges and high ground, avoiding the waterlogged valleys, following the natural grain of the landscape. They are worn into the chalk and sandstone by millions of feet over thousands of years, and the grooves they form are wide. Wide in a way that, when you think about it carefully, suggests a stride length somewhat greater than the stride length of an average modern person. This is, I acknowledge, the weakest piece of evidence in this entire discussion. Trackway width is determined by the cumulative effect of many feet over many years, and it reflects the width of the path that users keep clear of vegetation as much as the width of any individual user's stride. I raise it not as strong evidence, but as a prompt. A prompt to think about the physical reality of the people who wore these paths into the landscape. Every step they took was a real step, by a real body, of real dimensions. The path is the cumulative record of those steps. And when the path is wider than you'd expect, it is worth asking why. The crossing points of ancient trackways are often marked by standing stones or cairns. These markers served as navigational aids, visible from a distance to travelers approaching from either direction, and the standing stones used as crossing markers where they survive are often taller than seems strictly necessary for the navigation function. A stone of 1 meter high is visible from a considerable distance on open moorland. A stone of 3 meters high is visible from much further. The extra height costs proportionally more in labor to achieve. Why pay that extra cost unless visibility over very long distances was required, or unless a very tall person needed to be able to see the marker from their own height rather than from the average observer's height? This is, again, at the speculative end of the argument, but it sits alongside everything else, and everything else is pointing in the same direction. Now let us go north one more time, to Scotland, because the Scottish evidence deserves its own sustained attention, and we have touched on it only briefly. Scotland's prehistoric monument tradition is in some ways the most dramatic in Britain. The landscapes of Orkney and the Western Isles contain concentrations of Neolithic and Bronze Age monuments that, for their geographic extent and their density, rival anything in Wiltshire or the Thames Valley. The Cairn, standing stones on the Isle of Lewis, built around 3000 BCE, are a complex of multiple stone circles and avenue alignments covering a substantial area of moorland. The main circle at Cairn is smaller than Avebury, but more atmospherically dramatic, rising from a bleak moorland landscape that has changed little since the stones were erected. The Cairn stones are tall. The central monolith, the tallest stone in the main circle, is nearly 5 meters high. The stones of the main circle average perhaps 2 to 2.5 meters. They are slabs of Lewisian gneiss, one of the oldest rock formations on Earth, some of it over 3 billion years old. The people who erected these stones were working with some of the most ancient material on the planet, and they chose it deliberately. Lewisian gneiss, from this part of Lewis, is not just any rock. It is the rock of the deep past of the Earth itself. Its selection for the construction of the monument suggests a community with a sophisticated understanding of the landscape's geological history and a willingness to invest considerable effort in selecting and working a specific material. The local tradition of the Cairn stones, as recorded in the ethnographic literature of the 19th century, describes them as the fur braig, the false men, standing stones that were once real men who were turned to stone for refusing to convert to Christianity, which is the standard Christian rationalization of a much older tradition. The older tradition, preserved in fragments in the Gaelic literature of the Hebrides, describes the stones as memorials to a people who were taller than the current inhabitants and who built the monument before those inhabitants arrived. The detail of height is specific, and it appears in sources that predate the Victorian era and the giant tradition in its modern popular form. It is a native Gaelic tradition, not a tourist legend or a romantic invention. The Bronze Age brocks of northern Scotland present a related puzzle. Brocks are circular dry stone towers, hollow-walled and corbelled to create an internal staircase, with an interior central space that varies in diameter, but which in the larger examples is 10 meters or more across. The brocks are Iron Age and early historic in date, not Neolithic, built between roughly 400 BCE and 200 CE. But they are built in a tradition of dry stone construction that extends back through the Bronze Age to the Neolithic, and they share certain architectural characteristics with the older chambered cairns, including, in the larger examples, interior spaces of considerable height. The internal space of a large broch, the ground floor interior, is typically several meters high. The walls rise to whatever the original height of the tower was, now usually reduced by collapse to perhaps 3 or 4 meters of surviving wall. But in the intact brocks, or in the reconstructed assessments of their original dimensions, the interior height was substantially greater. Moosa Broch, on the Shetland island of Moosa, the best-preserved broch in Scotland, retains its original height of about 13 metres, and the internal staircase rises through the full height of the wall. An interior that is 13 metres high is over 40 feet. That is not functional headroom. That is architecture on a different scale. But wait, brochs are towers. Their height is a defensive function as much as anything. The height gives an advantage over attackers, provides a refuge above ground floor level where fire or assault is most dangerous. The height of a broch interior is not necessarily calibrated to the height of its occupants. It is calibrated to the defensive logic of the structure. This is a legitimate counter to the argument I have been building, and I acknowledge it. Brochs are not the same as chambered cairns. The defensive function of vertical height in a broch is real and does not require any reference to the stature of the occupants. But the broch tradition, including the specific design of internal spaces, the corbelling technique, the dry stone construction, the circular plan, all of these connect to an older Scottish and Northern Irish tradition of circular dry stone construction that extends back into the Bronze Age, and in some interpretations, to the late Neolithic. And in those older constructions, the same architectural language is deployed in contexts where the defensive rationale is less clear and where the interior heights exceed what defensive function obviously requires. The Dun tradition of the Western Isles, the Atlantic roundhouses of the Scottish Iron Age, and the souterrains, the underground passages and chambers found associated with many Iron Age and later sites across northern Britain, all share a common architectural DNA that connects back to the Neolithic chambered monument tradition. And in the souterrains, in particular, the interior dimensions raise the same questions we have been asking all evening. Souterrains are underground passages, typically associated with Iron Age farmsteads that were used for storage and possibly for refuge. They are typically low and narrow, designed for crawling or crouching entry, not for standing. But the chambers associated with some souterrains, the terminal rooms at the end of the access passages, are taller, in some cases considerably taller. Taller than the access passage would suggest is necessary if the space is simply for storing pots of grain or jars of dairy. The design logic of restricted entry opening into a tall interior space, which we have been tracking from the Neolithic chambered tombs through the portal dolmens and into the later prehistoric traditions, persists into the Iron Age in a form adapted to a different construction method and a different immediate function. The people who built the souterrains were not Neolithic farmers with an Anatolian genetic ancestry. They were the Iron Age inhabitants of northern Scotland, with their own complex genetic history. But they were building in a landscape that contained the Neolithic monuments that had been shaped by a Neolithic tradition they were heir to, and whose architectural practices encoded preferences and specifications that originated in the physical reality of the people who built first. The design is inherited. The proportions are remembered. The stone preserves the memory of a height that the builders themselves may no longer have possessed, but whose legacy in the landscape shaped everything that came after. Before we close, I want to take you through a few more threads that we have only touched the surface of, because the picture we have been building is not yet complete, and the incompleteness matters. There is a site in the Scottish borders called Cairn Papaill Hill in West Lothian that spans a remarkable range of prehistoric periods. The hill was used from the Neolithic through the Bronze Age and into the Iron Age, and the successive phases of monument construction there tell a story about how one sacred landscape was used and reinterpreted by successive populations over several thousand years. The earliest Neolithic phase at Cairn Papaill involved a series of cremation burials arranged around a low platform. Later came a stone circle, then a large henge monument, then a series of Bronze Age cairns built over the earlier structures, incorporating them into a new monument tradition, while acknowledging and, in some sense, consecrating the older forms. The sequence at Cairn Papaill is a microcosm of the broader British prehistoric pattern: new people arriving, new ways of doing things, but a persistent engagement with the same sacred places, a reverence for the landscape memory encoded in the earlier monuments. And within that sequence, the architectural dimensions we have been discussing persist. The Neolithic phase at Cairn Papaill, though less dramatic than the Great Passage graves, shows the same design principles. Spaces calibrated to a physical scale that exceeds the functional minimum for a population of average Neolithic height. The circle phase, with its standing stones, shows the same preference for height and scale. The Bronze Age cairns, while different in form, are still large-bodied structures occupying a hilltop that was evidently chosen for its visibility and its elevation. The hill itself rises above the surrounding landscape in a way that makes the activity on its summit visible from considerable distances, and the monuments on its summit are sized to be commensurate with that visibility. Visibility is a theme in all of this. The megalithic monuments of Britain are, without exception, designed to be seen. They occupy prominent positions in the landscape. They are built to the scale required to make their presence felt across the surrounding terrain. And the scale required for visibility is, in most cases, considerably larger than the scale required for the practical functions of burial or ceremony. You don't need a 10-meter-high trilithon to bury the dead. You don't need a 100-meter diameter stone circle to perform a seasonal ceremony. The excess of scale, the deliberate grandeur of these monuments, is always beyond what function strictly requires. This excess of scale has been interpreted as symbolic power. These are monuments to the power of the communities that built them, expressions of social dominance and territorial claim. That interpretation is certainly part of the story, but it sits alongside the functional interpretation we have been exploring all evening. The excess of scale may be simultaneously symbolic and functional. The monuments are large because the communities had the power to build large, and because large meant something socially and spiritually. And within that large, the specific interior dimensions, the heights of chambers and passages and portals, may reflect the specific physical requirements of the people who used them. The outer grandeur is social display. The interior calibration is functional specification. And the interior calibration is what the stone preserves most faithfully. A monument that has collapsed and lost its external profile still reveals, in its surviving structural elements, the original interior dimensions. The fallen trilithons of Stonehenge, the capstones that have slid off their supports at dozens of portal dolmens, the corbel stones that have scattered from the roofs of chambered cairns, all of these can be used to reconstruct the original interior heights. And when that reconstruction is done, the numbers are what we have been discussing. Consistently above the minimum for the known Neolithic population, consistently calibrated to something larger. The Neolithic of Britain was a world of tremendous creative energy. The monument building tradition, which spans from roughly 4000 BCE to 2000 BCE, represents 2000 years of organized collective labor aimed at transforming the landscape into a sacred and meaningful space. 2000 years is longer than from the Roman conquest of Britain to the present day. It is longer than the entire period of recorded British history. Within that span, generations of builders maintained a consistent tradition while also innovating, developing new forms, incorporating new ideas, responding to changing social and environmental conditions. The consistency of the tradition across such a long period and across such a large geographic area speaks to a deep cultural coherence. These people knew who they were and what they were doing. They were not improvising. They were executing a vision that had deep roots and wide distribution. That vision included the physical specifications of the built spaces. And those specifications, consistently, across 2000 years and the full geographic range of Neolithic Britain, produced interior spaces that exceed the known average for Neolithic stature. This consistency is not explicable as accident or individual whim. It is a design tradition, a tradition that preserved and reproduced a particular scale relationship between built space and human body. A relationship that suggests the human body being catered for was not the average Neolithic body, but something larger, something that the stone still remembers, if you know how to ask. The standing stones of the Orkney Islands, rising from a moorland landscape that has barely changed in 5,000 years, are as close as you can get in this part of the world to the experience of standing in the original Neolithic landscape. The modern world hasn't much intruded on the Orkney moors. The sky is still wide and cold. The wind is still constant. The sea is still on every horizon. And in the middle of this ancient landscape, the stones stand as they have always stood, marking a geography of meaning that we have mostly lost the ability to read. But we can read the height. We can read the height of the entrance to Maeshowe, the way the passage is low at the entry and opens upward as you move deeper in. We can read the height of the chamber walls, rising to their corbelled ceiling. We can read the height of the ring of Brodgar stones, standing against the sky, taller than any practical function requires. We can read all of this as a language written in stone by people who were speaking about scale, about height, about the relationship between the human body and the space that body requires. And the language, read carefully, says something specific, something that has been said all evening in many different ways. The people who built these things were taller than us, not as tall as the mythology says, but taller than the averages suggest. Tall enough that the difference mattered. Tall enough that it was built into the stone. Tall enough that the stone, 6,000 years later, still tells you so, if you stand in the doorway and measure the height above your head and ask the right question. The evidence is still standing. The doorways are still tall. The question is still open. And the stone is still waiting. There are researchers working quietly, outside the mainstream academic institutions, who are making progress on these questions. People like Andrew Collins, who has spent decades researching the relationship between Britain's prehistoric monuments and the folk traditions attached to them, and who has documented the consistent pattern of giant attribution in the folklore of specific sites. People like Hugh Newman, who has studied the megalithic traditions of Britain and their global parallels with a rigor and a seriousness that the mainstream frequently underestimates. People like Graham Hancock, whose work on ancient civilizations, whatever its methodological controversies, has pushed the mainstream conversation toward questions it would prefer not to ask. These researchers are not cranks. They are people who have looked at the same evidence we have been discussing tonight and drawn similar conclusions to the ones I have been presenting, sometimes more boldly and sometimes with less methodological caution than the evidence strictly warrants. Their work is part of the conversation, and the conversation is more interesting and more important than it is usually given credit for being, because these are not idle questions. They are questions about who we are and where we came from and what the deep past of this island, this landscape we inhabit, actually looks like. They are questions about the reliability of the institutions that are supposed to preserve our understanding of that past. They are questions about what we owe to the people who came before us, the people who built the doorways that are still standing in the fields and the moorlands and the groves of this island, waiting for us to come and stand in them and look up and wonder. We owe them the question. At minimum, we owe them the question. We owe it to the builders to ask, seriously and persistently and without premature closure, who they were and what they were like, and what the stone they left us is actually saying about their bodies and their world. We owe it to the landscape to pay attention to what it is still telling us, in the height of the entrance and the height of the chamber and the height of the standing stone against the sky. We owe it to ourselves to be honest about the limits of what we know and courageous about the implications of what the evidence suggests. The stone is patient, the question is patient, and somewhere in the north of England, the doorway is still standing. There is another site that deserves its own careful attention before we are done. The Ness of Brodgar, on the same narrow isthmus of land as the ring of Brodgar and the stones of Stenness, is one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in recent British history. Excavations begun in 2003 and still ongoing have revealed a complex of stone-built structures covering an area of roughly 2.5 hectares, far larger than the visible standing stones and circles that have always been the famous landmarks of this part of Orkney. The Ness of Brodgar was a ceremonial centre, an architectural complex, a settlement of some kind, active from roughly 3,200 BCE to 2,300 BCE and possibly longer. It is contemporary with the Ring of Brodgar and Maeshowe, and it appears to have been the hub of activity in this landscape, the place from which the monument-building tradition of the Orkney Neolithic was organised and sustained. The structures at the Ness of Brodgar are remarkable. They are stone buildings, carefully constructed with double-skinned walls and interior furnishings, some of them with standing stone elements incorporated into their interiors in ways that blur the distinction between domestic architecture and monumental construction. They are not houses in the ordinary Neolithic sense, though they share the basic structural vocabulary of the Skara Brae dwellings. They are something more, something between a house and a temple, something that served functions we are still working to understand, and their interior dimensions are, once again, larger than you would expect. The buildings of the Ness of Brodgar have interior spaces of considerable height, preserved in the surviving wall courses, that suggest original room heights above the functional minimum for a standard Neolithic population. Some of the individual structures are large enough to have functioned as gathering spaces for significant numbers of people. The largest of the Ness buildings, Structure 10, known informally as the Cathedral because of its scale, is the largest Neolithic building in Britain. Its interior is vast by Neolithic standards, and the wall construction suggests it was built to be tall as well as wide. The Ness of Brodgar excavations have produced some of the most extraordinary Neolithic art in Britain, in the form of painted stone surfaces and carved geometric motifs on the walls and floors of the buildings. This is an unprecedented finding. The idea that the Neolithic builders of Orkney were painting the interiors of their buildings, creating elaborately decorated spaces for ritual and social use, transforms our understanding of their cultural world. They were not austere Stone Age farmers. They were people with a rich aesthetic life, people who valued beauty and invested considerable effort in creating beautiful environments for their ceremonies and their communal life. This aesthetic complexity is consistent with everything else we have been learning about the Neolithic population of Britain. They were not primitive. They were not simple. They were organized, aesthetically sophisticated, astronomically knowledgeable, and architecturally ambitious people who built at a scale that exceeded their practical needs, and whose built environment reflected a vision of the world that was both practical and spiritual. They built large because they were large. They built high because they needed the height. And when they were gone, the largeness remained in the stone, as a record of something that was once real, and that we are only now beginning to properly ask questions about. The Ness of Brodgar will continue to yield surprises as excavation continues. Each season of digging reveals new structures, new artifacts, new evidence of a community that was more complex and more impressive than any previous assessment had allowed. And with each new discovery, the question of the physical characteristics of the people who created this complexity becomes more pressing. Who were they? What did they look like? How tall were they, standing in their painted stone buildings on this narrow strip of land between two lochs 5,000 years ago, looking out at the ring of standing stones they had built on the ridge above? We don't know. Not yet. But the ground at the Ness of Brodgar is still full of them, their bones and their objects and their building stones, waiting for the archaeologists' trowels to find them and for the modern scientific methods to tell us what they were. Perhaps the next decade of excavation at the Ness will produce the kind of skeletal evidence that has been so systematically missing from the record elsewhere. Perhaps the ancient DNA extracted from those bones will tell us something about the physical characteristics of the builders that the current skeletal averages don't capture. Perhaps the full picture, the picture that the stone has been pointing toward for 6,000 years, will begin to come clear. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the bones at the Ness will conform to the expected Neolithic range, and the chambers will be explained as ceremonial excess, and the folklore will be dismissed as primitive imagination, and the Victorian documentation will be attributed to enthusiastic misidentification, and the whole body of evidence we have been examining tonight will continue to be held in the uncomfortable middle ground where it has always lived. Neither proved nor disproved, neither explained nor explained away, just sitting there, in the field, in the stone, in the height of the entrance to the oldest buildings in Britain, still asking, still waiting, still standing. Let us come back to the beginning one more time, because the beginning is where the argument is most clearly felt. There is a doorway in the north of England that has been standing for so long that nobody alive today knows who built it. You have heard me say this twice now, and it is worth saying a third time, because the weight of that sentence changes once you have walked through the evidence we have been covering together. Nobody alive knows who built it. The people who built it are gone. They were replaced, genetically and culturally, by a succession of incoming populations over the 3,000 years after they raised the last stone. They became the folk memory, the giants, the old ones, the tall ones. They became the Sidian and the Tuatha and the Fir Braig. They became the names attached to the monuments, the apronful of the giantess, the house of the giant, the smithy of the divine craftsman, the stone of the tall people. They dissolved into mythology, as all real things eventually do when the people who remember them in the flesh are gone. But the doorway remained, the stone remained. And the doorway is still a little taller than it needs to be for the people who pass by it today, walking the path across the moor with their hiking poles and their waterproofs, glancing at the monument before moving on. The doorway was built for someone else, for someone who is no longer here, for someone whose size is preserved in the stone the way a cast preserves the shape of what was pressed into it, the shape remaining long after the original is gone. What do we do with this? What do we do with a body of evidence that is real but incomplete, suggestive but not conclusive, consistent but not provable? What do we do with the missing bones and the tall chambers and the persistent folklore and the Victorian documentation and the genetic replacements and the vanished specimens? I think the honest answer is that we hold it. We hold it as an open question. We resist the temptation to collapse it prematurely, either into confirmation of the mainstream narrative, everything is explained, nothing unusual happened here, or into the full apparatus of the alternative narrative, giants built everything, the establishment is lying, the truth is being suppressed. Both of those collapses are intellectually premature. The evidence doesn't support the full mainstream dismissal. The evidence doesn't support the full alternative spectacular either. The evidence supports a middle position that is, in its own way, more interesting than either extreme. The middle position is this. Britain's prehistoric populations were more physically varied and included individuals of greater physical stature than the current mainstream skeletal averages suggest. That physical variation left its mark on the built environment in the form of chambers and passages designed to accommodate bodies of greater than average size. The folk tradition of the peoples who came after preserved a memory of the builders as taller and more capable than the subsequent population. The institutional archaeological record has been compromised through a combination of deliberate suppression and ordinary institutional entropy in ways that have removed much of the most direct physical evidence from accessible collections. And the stone is still standing, still measurable, still asking the question. The stone is still standing. That is the most important fact in this entire discussion. Everything else I have described to you tonight, the Victorian documentation, the folklore, the genetics, the parallel evidence from other continents, all of it is important and worth thinking about. But the stone is the thing. The stone doesn't need a historian or a folklorist or an archivist. The stone is there, in the field, in the chalk, in the beech grove, in the moor, in the churchyard, in the harbour mouth, on the island, on the ridge. The stone is there, and the stone has dimensions, and the dimensions tell a story. Go and stand in front of it. Go to Wayland's Smithy on a misty morning, or West Kennet Long Barrow at dusk, or Pentre Ifan on a February afternoon when the wind is coming off the sea, or Kit's Coty house when the fields around it are ploughed and empty. Go and stand at the threshold. Look up at the height of the entrance. Put your hand on the stone. Measure the height of the chamber above you with your eye, and ask the question, who was this built for? The stone will not answer you. The stone never answers, but it will hold the question. It has been holding the question for 6,000 years. It will hold it a little longer. There is something about these places, something beyond the archaeology and the folklore and the measurements that speaks to a part of you that is not interested in academic arguments. The part of you that recognizes something, that feels, in the presence of the old stone, that it is remembering something it has never consciously known. This is not mysticism. It is not supernatural. It is what happens when an animal species with 250,000 years of continuous memory, most of it preserved, not in written records but in the body itself, in the deep structures of the nervous system and the patterns of emotional response, encounters the physical traces of its own deep past. You are descended from the people who built these things, not directly, not in any simple genealogical sense, but in the sense that they are in the ancestral network, the vast web of human ancestry that spreads backward through time and eventually includes everyone who ever lived in this landscape. Their genes are a fraction of what became you, diluted by millennia of mixing and replacement and drift. But they are there. And when you stand at the threshold and feel something that is not quite recognition, but is something adjacent to it, what you are feeling is the resonance between your own deep past and the stone that past left behind. The tall ones built tall doorways. The tall ones are gone. The doorways remain. And the question remains with them, open, unanswered, waiting for someone to come with new tools and new data and new courage and push the inquiry further than it has been pushed before. Waiting for the day when an ancient DNA sample from a long Barrow skeleton that hasn't yet been lost confirms a living height that changes the narrative. Waiting for the day when ground-penetrating radar reveals a burial at a familiar site whose dimensions are impossible to explain away. Waiting for the day when someone with access to the institutional archives comes out of the building with a box and opens it, and there, inside, are the bones that were supposed to have been lost a century ago. Maybe that day will come. Maybe it won't. The stone will be there either way. Let us spend our last time together tonight walking through the specific places one more time, because I want to give you a set of places you can actually visit. Real locations where you can stand in the threshold and feel the weight of the question for yourself. Wayland Smithy, Oxfordshire. Access from the Ridgeway long-distance path, open at all times. Walk to it from the B4000 near Ashbury, through beech woodland. The approach is part of the experience. West Kennet, Long Barrow, Wiltshire. A 10-minute walk from the road between Avebury and West Kennet village, open at all times. Bring a torch for the interior and a willingness to be patient with the other visitors. Go early or late if you can. Stony Littleton. Long Barrow, Somerset, near Wellow, south of Bath. The key is available from the nearby farmhouse. Worth the effort of arranging it in advance. Pentre y Fan, Pembrokeshire, the most dramatically sighted portal dolmen in Britain, approached across open farmland with views to the sea, open at all times. Maeshowe, Orkney. Now a ticketed attraction managed by Historic Environment Scotland. Book ahead, especially in summer. The winter solstice alignment viewing is the most popular event, but any visit rewards the attention. Kit's Coty House, Kent, near Aylesford, in the North Downs. A short walk from the road, small but atmospheric, and, in the dolmen category, one of the most clearly structured examples of the tall portal design. The Ring of Brodgar, Orkney. Open at all times. Approach on foot from the road, and give yourself time to walk the full circle before the coaches arrive. Calanes, Isle of Lewis. Walk around the full complex, not just the main circle. The subsidiary alignments and satellite circles give the site its full complexity. All of these places will reward you with the experience I have been describing. The threshold, the measurement, the question, the stone that holds the question and does not answer it. It is worth making the journey. It is worth standing in the doorway and looking at the height of the stone above your head and thinking about who designed it at this height, and why, and what they were like, and where they went. The old ones built something that lasted. Something that will outlast every institutional catalogue and every academic consensus and every newspaper account and every lost box in every basement of every museum. The stone will be there after all of that is gone. The stone will be there when the questions we are currently unable to answer have been answered, or when the questions have changed because our understanding of what we are and where we come from has shifted enough to make the old questions obsolete and new ones possible. The stone is patient. It has been waiting since before our oldest written records. It will wait as long as it needs to. The doorway is still tall. The builders are still somewhere inside the landscape, inside the folk memory, inside the mythology, inside the stone, inside the question. Go and find them. Go and stand at the threshold of the oldest doors in Britain and let the stone speak to you in the only language it has. Not words, not answers, but the irreducible physical fact of height. The height of the entrance, the height of the chamber, the height of the space designed for the people who are no longer here but whose size is still recorded, precisely and permanently, in the stone they raised. Who built these doorways? They did. The ones who came before, the ones who were taller. The ones the stories remember as giants, though the word giant is what folk memory does to the word tall when enough centuries have passed. The ones who built at a scale that made sense for the scale of their own bodies, and who left that scale encoded in sarsen and dolerite and limestone and gneiss for 6,000 years as a message, as a question, as a height, still standing, still measurable, still waiting for you to come and stand in the doorway and look up and wonder. The old ones were here, and in the stone, in some essential and unmovable sense, they still are. That is where we will leave it tonight, in the stone, in the doorway. In the height of the entrance, and the height of the chamber, and the height of the question that the oldest buildings in Britain ask every person who comes to stand before them and is paying attention. The Neolithic builders of Britain shaped stone in ways that still challenge our understanding. They moved loads that still challenge our engineering. They built spaces whose internal dimensions still challenge our assumptions about the bodies they were designed for. And they left a tradition in every county of this island, in every language spoken here across the millennia, that says the same thing in different words across different centuries. The ones who built the old things were taller than us. The ones who built the old things are gone. The old things remain. Go and stand in the doorway. Let the stone hold you. Let the question hold you. And sleep well tonight, wherever you are in the world, knowing that somewhere in the north of England and the west of Wales and the islands of the north, the old doorways are standing in the dark and the rain, tall and patient and full of memory, as they have been standing for 6,000 years, and will be standing, very probably, long after the questions we are asking tonight have been replaced by answers. The tall ones, built for the ages. We are in those ages now. Rest now. Let the stone stand guard.